So maybe,
Well, press it then.
Yeah.
Please.
just about 1 minute.
So, consider it.
Okay.
Should dive in if we can make it work. Otherwise, Mark's doing it. Are we good to go? Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. If I can open this meeting of the Health Education England Board and welcome all of you to our first meeting since, I'm told by Nicola, February 2020. So it feels a long time, and it's, I have to say, it's very nice to see people in the flesh. So a very, very big welcome. Thanks to Matt, your team, for actually just making technology work and possible. So big thank you for that before we get started. And particularly welcome to Graham, our postgraduate dean, who's going to help with one of our items, Sophie, who's going to speak to us about her experiences as an Obs-and-Gynae trainee, and I hope we can have Elspeth join us, who's a student midwife, and will share her experiences. That'll be technology dependent, so a big welcome. Welcome to all the colleagues as well. So let's do apologies, Nicola, please.
So we've got apologies from Andrew Foster, Sir Andrew Morris, Alfred Seuss, Navina Evans and Lee Whitehead.
Okay. So item 2 of the agenda is declarations of interest. The report is there in front of you. Is there anything anybody wants to add or amend in relation to this?
Yeah, one more for me, David. It was only announced last week, that's why it's not on. So I'm chair designate for the Cambridge Integrated Care Place, and it's not on the.
Okay. And any more? No. Okay. So we will note that. Well, you met your beautiful introduction then, Liz, to the bit that I wanted to do now, which is just thanks to you for all the work that you've done at Health Education England over the period that you've been a member of this board. I think your contribution, Chair of the Public Advisory Forum, as we have now renamed it and called it, and your redevelopment of that, I think it's been absolutely outstanding. So thank you for that. You've also been part of the recruitment, the audit and risk, the people and culture, and of course it probably also fits in the assignment of that Freedom to Speak Up Guardian report, that you've been the board's champion for Freedom to Speak Up as well. So I am going to say in public, I did try and persuade you to stay, and it's another one of my long list of failures, I'm afraid, but I didn't manage to get you to stay. But as you say, you've got this local role chairing Kirklees Integrated Care Place Committee. God knows what that acronym is going to be, but anyway, which will give you that local connection with the community that you were part of and live in. And, you know, we wish you every success with that. You've been an absolutely fabulous colleague to work with. Your care and attention, your industry, your application to the issues that we deal with has been terrific. And the fact that you've worked in local government, you've worked in the NHS as a Trust Chief Executive of Academic Health Science Networks, you've got the connections with higher and further education has been a real service to us and helped us in those things. So I can't thank you enough, and I'm sure I speak for every single member of the board and every member of the executive team in offering you our thanks and appreciation, and very, very best wishes for what you're going to go on to do. Yeah.
Oh, it's exhausting.
Oh, thank you. Oh, beautiful. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, David, and just thank you to our colleagues. I've really enjoyed working with you, and David did try to persuade me to stay. And it's not a reflection on anybody here or David, but I didn't. It's just that I am going on to this other local role, and I didn't feel like I'd be able to give enough time to both very busy agendas. So thank you. I've loved working with every single one of you. Please do keep in touch. I'll be keeping in touch with you. I think ringing you up saying, "Oh, that makes what I'm doing." And thank you, David, for giving me the opportunity to chair PAF, because it's been fantastic. I've really enjoyed it, and I think we've made sort of strides forward and increased the involvement of public patient carers. Thank you, everybody.
Well, I think Phil's joining you later, isn't he, when you present the work that you did at the last meeting. So that's terrific. So with that, and we're going to make you work in this last meeting as well, Liz, so we're not going to get away just with thanks, but big thank you. So next item is item 4, which is the board and committee schedule, which I invite any. Oh, wait a minute, I'm doing this wrong, aren't I? It's not the next item. The next item is the approval of the minutes of our meeting on the 15th of March. Any colleague wishes to comment on accuracy? No, any matters arising anybody wants to raise? Okay, so if we accept those as a record of our meeting, Nicola, thank you again to you and the team for those minutes. And then the next item is the board and committee schedule. I'll just invite us to note this, unless there's anything you want to say.
No, that's just the schedule that takes us through to the end of the year for all board meetings, and the majority of the committees have got a couple more to schedule in. I have done a check. I've had some feedback that I've got the dates as Wednesdays. They're Wednesdays if they were 2023, but they're ahead of this year.
But yeah, enjoyed sending that email.
I've not sent it.
I mean, right. Mark, I think you're going to present Navina's report. I think board members know, but Navina is spending the day with NHS England. They've got an executive development day, and when Navina and I discussed it, I think one of the really important roles of the chief executive is to secure the future, and that was about securing the future. So it was a pretty easy choice to make. So I wouldn't want anybody to think that it's not about an interest in the work that we continue to do at Health Education England. But the purpose of having 2 very able deputies is that they can actually step into the brief. So, able deputy number 1, over to you. You'll go and collect it.
Reception.
No, it's you. And then David will do the private board as well. So, yeah.
Thanks, David. Thanks, colleagues. So obviously, reports in the bundle from Navina, but there are some highlights I think that are worthy talking about. But first of all, I just want to say a thank you to Health Education England teams up and down the country. You know, their continued and vital work is really very much appreciated. I recognise that our students, learning trainees are continuing in their education and supporting roles up and down the country in the NHS, which still remains pressured as we come through this pandemic, as well as the recovery of services. And I know how much support their supervisors, trainees and educators are providing them in clinical practice in the university. So I just want to say thank you to all of those colleagues who are doing their great work. The CEO report updates a number of really important areas. So I'm going to just take as read that you've gone through the majority of these, but I just want to lift out 2 or 3 really as hopefully areas for thought and discussion. Obviously, priority with Navina working with NHS England today, obviously the transition programme update. The paper highlights obviously that there are now the Health and Social Care Bill has received royal assent and now Act of Parliament. The progress on this, particularly in terms of the statutory merger between NHS England improvement and also the creation of the integrated care systems, will occur on the 1st of July and sets the framework then, of course, for the merger and integration of NHS Digital X and of course HEE. Obviously this is being led through Navina and many teams across Health Education England with Philippa Spicer doing a huge amount of the work in relation to the delivery of the programme of the integration. There is a transition programme set up, which is hand in glove with Mark Coven, Chief Delivery Officer at NHS England. Work progresses really well. We've had a number of sessions, both as an exec and with our regional director colleagues, in terms of making sure that we're updating and progressing on that. A workforce function review completed by KPMG has reported, which has identified a lot of opportunity, rich opportunity, and those outputs will fundamentally drive some of the work over the next few months to further develop that. Of course, alongside this, we continue to engage with multiple stakeholders across the system in terms of our AR code work, which is obviously vitally important to continue with, but also the future of the landscape as well. And of course, the National Stakeholder Survey, which we routinely publish, has highlighted again very positive views about the relationship and the value that we place in terms of the work that we do in the system. But of course, strong message from stakeholders about how that continues in the new organisational form. So again, very valuable and rich feedback to support how we're taking forward both the culture as well as also the technical nature of the integration, and streamlining where we can the opportunities to revise our operating approach within the new architecture of the NHS from next year. So again, really valuable. From an internal perspective, obviously, our focusing on our staff during this time is absolutely mission critical. They need to be fully supported so they can continue their vital work in supporting learners and trainees and innovating across the system. So we continue to test experiences of our staff to make sure that we're getting valuable pulse feedback in terms of their experience. So health and wellbeing is one of our chief areas of concern, particularly in relation to best place at work, notably that we're working in a hybrid environment at the moment. And the paper obviously indicates how we'll be moving and transitioning to this. And the report gives some detail of the type of questions we've been asking ourselves as an organisation and reaching out into our community of support of our staff to identify specific areas of concern, of course, but importantly, what actions we need to take, and the paper sets out some of the approaches we'll be doing that. I just want to finish on a couple of areas to highlight. Firstly, I think it's really a phenomenal work, actually, and full credit to Professor Liz Hughes on work promoting disability and equality, improving learning experience. This is genuinely transformational and phenomenal, and I'd like to commend Liz, policy team and others on the work in this, and been working directly with the Disabled Students Commission across into DFE and other departments. I think this is extremely important work, and we'll obviously share some of that work with you so you can see the richness of what it does, but again, really important. 50,000 nurses is a key mandate for our government. HEE has been in partnership with NHS England, the Department of Health and others. We remain solidly on track in terms of the delivery of this, and recently we had a deep dive at the performance report, performance group with Andrew's leadership to go into this in detail. And whilst we continue to work with government on the trajectories related to this, it's very dynamic in the current environment, but I'm confident that we will remain on track to deliver this manifesto commitment with some adjustments in interventions that might need to take place over the next couple of years to do that. And further in the report, of course, highlights the white paper, and importantly, we've seen a great example of the work, particularly in general practice. DEC have been developing a programme of work which was opened by Sir David in looking at the reform opportunities within training and education, which again I know is an area of real appetite across our board in terms of the reform agenda, both to medical, nursing, allied health professional education, again working with stakeholders to see what opportunities this may arise in terms of delivering services to the health and social care system. And the final item in there is an update in relation to the recent news in relation to the bursary debt issue, but this is a historic challenge that Callum and the team have been handling with NHSBA, but gives an update in relation to that which has been previously answered. So thank you very much, colleagues, and I'm very happy to answer questions or field into other executive colleagues.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you. So questions, comments, reflections? Andrew, please.
Thank you, Mark. Question slightly on something you didn't cover particularly, which is the hybrid working. I have no particular axe to grind in either direction on this one, but I'm just aware it's an issue that is obviously live, and it feels that we're taking a fairly permissive position with it. Could you just perhaps elaborate a bit more on that and the challenges and how we're overcoming those?
Absolutely, and colleagues may join me in comments on this. I would say we've engaged deeply within our organisation to speak with our teams about recognising the opportunities that the digital environment has offered us in the transition through the pandemic, and to learn from them what this means to them as individual teams in terms of the opportunities and the efficiencies that the digital gives us, but also recognising that for some, moving back into a work-based environment is a positive experience. Some do want to get back into an office-based environment, and others are going to find that transition more challenging. So we've tried to make the process smooth to ensure that we can have an opportunity with our team leaders to understand what the team's needs are, what is the best for the outcomes that we want to achieve for our organisation, and then build in mechanics associated with how do we make that happen. So would it be hybrid environments like this, an opportunity to work at home, and then more set days within the office. Other organisations, as the paper highlights, have been more directive in days within the office, but we think that the right thing for our organisation, recognising what we've learned from the pandemic, is to take a much more flexible approach led by the leadership within the organisation, and also then clearly look at the outputs that are generated from that.
And are there some principles though, because I mean, you're giving team leaders a lot of responsibility to get it right for their team, which I think is right. But are there principles so that we don't get disparity between the ways in which this is implemented in different parts of HEE?
The short answer is we are going to have to work in this hybrid way for a period of time, regularly touching base and identifying what risks and benefits there are. So as they emerge, if there are particular issues or disparities that emerge, then as a leadership team, we can address those and think if other engagement is required with the teams across HEE to improve that or keep as is.
Let me Liz signalled and then John, and I'll bring Vicky in as well. And Liz.
Yeah, so it's just a couple of comments actually about the survey. So great to see on the best place to work survey that's more staff are thinking that we take action on health and wellbeing. So it's a small increase, but it's great to see that because a lot of work has been done there. So well done to everybody that's been involved in that. And the other one was the pulse survey of stakeholders. And that was really interesting actually, because stakeholders were saying that they could see the benefit of the merger of HEE with Health Education England. And we know there's a lot of work to get there, but I didn't think it was good that stakeholders could see that it's the right direction of travel. And we have sort of noted that in the board, and we said the timings may be difficult, but it's the right direction of travel. So I thought it was really interesting to see that, the support for that, and hopefully our sort of closest stakeholders will be helping us with that.
Yeah, Giles, I'll bring you in on this. Let me. Can we just finish flexible working and come in on that? So you want to come in on flexible working?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. Yeah.
So for me, I think it's important that exactly as Mark said, that we have a very flexible approach. I suppose for me, having seen this in another organisation I sat on the board of where it's gone a bit wrong, is where the language that's used when you communicate with staff, particularly around worrying. The organisation, if I'm being blunt, was more worried about sustainability than it was the mental health of the staff. So it was very keen to people working from home. So although they were saying you could come in, the language of the communications were, it's very trendy to be at home, isn't it? Good to be at home. Whereas a lot of their staff actually did want to come into work, but they felt that the organisation was saying it might be nice if you didn't. And therefore, I think the language of communication is really important in this place, which is we're open, you can come in. You can do what, and if you're not going to come in, then that's fine also. But it's the way in which you actually emphasise, the way in which you support people. because I am primarily more worried about people's mental health. There's a lot of people who've been waiting for the end of the pandemic to be able to come in. And, you know, when organisations then don't really give that strong message, it causes them a lot of strain, and we're seeing some quite significant increase in that.
Very interesting. I stood all the way into London this morning on the train. That's the first time in about 10 years I've had to stand from when I get on to all the way through. So that tells us something about maybe the number of trains running, actually. But Vicky, this is partly, I know this is work in progress rather than the final position, but do you want to?
Yeah, sure. If I just build on what Mark has said. So if I work backwards, first of all, the language. I mean, I couldn't agree more. And in fact, just to give you some reassurance, John, we pulled some comms that was going to go out today because we didn't think that we'd socialise the language in sufficient depth. So we feel that strongly about it. We're going to get lots of eyes on that language. There's been lots of consultation to get us to this position. We said it'd be a hostage to fortune to now release that comms without going back out to those stakeholder groups. So that's how important we're finding it. We're not going to make everyone happy. So we know whatever we do, it's not going to be perfect, and some people will react to the language, but we're going to give it our best shot to make sure that it's very well nuanced to reach a variety of different positions. Going back to your point, Andrew, on principles, yes, we're rewriting the flexible working policy at the moment. It's not going to be too much of a diktat. So there is a little bit of leader-led license in there, but leaders who want their teams in and feel that that work will benefit from that have got something to lean into in that policy. And we're also in the process of writing some guidance for leaders to help people who are perhaps nervous about coming back into the office or perhaps just don't want to. And we are trying to work through what does fair look like. We have had some feedback that some people don't want to come back into the office, not because they don't want to, but because they don't think it's fair that they've been asked to and others haven't. So there's still a bit of parity to work through. But the principles will say this is based on business need. If you have work to conduct that is better done in the office, then you can bring your teams in. If you're going to bring your teams in just to sit on Teams calls, that doesn't seem a useful use of people's travel time. So leader-led, we are not going to issue new contracts at this moment in time, but we will negotiate some individual home working contracts for those who perhaps have got physical or mental health issues, which means that they can't or don't want to at this moment come in, taking into the point about mental health.
David, did you want to come in on this?
I think, obviously.
Thank you. I think,
So just a very quick, more strategic point, obviously as an organisation that's promoting digital readiness and the use of digital technologies for education, it's important that we make sure that our own staff have got the skills so that wherever they're working, they can do that. So it's just an important part of embracing the issue.
No, thank you for that. I'd make an ask that then we then begin to redesign by things like mandatory training, so it reflects the fact that we've got blended learning, rather than assuming I work in a hospital, an acute trust, actually, which is my frustration having ticked off my mandatory.
So mandatory training is just in redesign now for that very purpose, and the IT department are rolling out some further training for staff on IT skills.
But a substantial point, I think, on this is that there must be a business case for this. It's not just about choice. So there is a sentence in here about it will be a mandated approach, but it will be ample flexibility built into it. So there's got to be a business case about what is the best and most effective use of the money we've got as an organisation and the people we've got, and for where people need to collaborate to actually produce whatever the product is, then I think we need to be very, very focused on what the business case is. This isn't a philosophical discussion. This is a very practical, hard-headed business conversation that needs to take place. Please. Right, so that was the future of work, and this is work in progress. So I think Mark, the Chief Executive Report, keeping the board sighted on this, you can see the interest that sits around the table is important to make sure that we continue to keep this within sight of the board. Giles, do you want to say anything about the stakeholder survey? I'm privileged of having seen a fuller report that Giles and Kelly have worked on, which I have to say I think is a very, very good piece of work. But you just want to say
Thank you.
this is preview.
Thank you, David. Yes, of course. So we are, I think, planning, as we did last year, to make the executive summary report available publicly. Obviously, the board will see the entire text document, but which is essentially not revealing who said particular things. But the headlines, I think, are very positive. I think it would be fairer to say that although people see opportunities from coming together with NHS England, they are concerned to preserve what they see as the uniqueness of HE's contribution to education and training in particular, and that is something that we will take forward. They also, in fairness, see advantages of bringing an organisation with HE's culture into a larger enterprise now, which I think will be helpful, but it is something that Philippa and those of us working with her to support her are keen to see brought forward. Equally, I think the opportunities are pretty clear about proper integration of planning around workforce with finance and service, which has been one of our significant challenges down the years of our existence. Streamlining how we work as a central body with other parts of the system would, I think, be a real win. But there are things we need to watch. So I think there is a plan, I believe, David, to have a conversation at a board development session to explore some of that with colleagues and for non-executives in particular, to check that we are taking forward a response to messages that makes the best of it for the future.
It's a very positive piece of work, I think, but I think there was nuance in it. There's to your point about the welcome. I think it was a welcome, providing that the focus on education continues rather than a straight, oh, this is a good thing. So I think what stakeholders are doing, we're flagging potential risks, and therefore it's important that we're cognizant of the risks and we actually take those into account in the conversations that we're involved in. Which is why I just wanted Giles to make those additional points. Any more questions, comments on Navina, Mark's report? Are we good? Okay, Mark, thank you very much. So we now go on to committee chairs updates. And what order are these coming in? Performance and business committee. Sorry, I'm just paging through. That's you, Andrew.
Thank you. There's a very full summary report here, which I will not repeat. So thank you for writing for that from our meeting on the 11th of April. I think the things that perhaps are in addition to that report that we need to talk about is to think about the transition process, because perhaps the transition process for the business of this committee is less clear than for some of the other committees, because there isn't an obvious sister committee in the other organisations that we're merging with. But David and his team are doing some work on outlining our processes to make it clear what the needs are for performance reporting for education and training, and hopefully we'll be able to use that to make sure that those are incorporated into the new system. But the rest of it, I think, happy to take questions. I think it stands stands well. That report.
No, thanks, Andrew. Any questions, comments, reflections? No. Okay. Next is People and Culture Committee, and given Andrew's his apologies. Anybody there? Yeah. Vicky, do you want to say anything about this? You look surprised, so sorry for that.
No, it's fine. No, that's my just general demeanour. Just want to pull out, and that is a very strong ask from Andrew, that in addition to a very detailed action plan around equality, diversity and inclusion, that we give it more of a strategic wrap-up, and just to give this committee assurance that that is work in progress, and Sarah and Harpreet have agreed to help us with that. that links with the work that I'm leading on the culture framework as well. So we've promised Andrew that that will come ready packaged for the next committee meeting.
And although we'll touch on this later in the agenda when we look at the transition, there's an awful lot of work going on from people committee to people committee in NHS-EI
Yes.
with the people committee here. So Andrew Foster and Andrew Morris, I think, have had some very positive conversations, which is very constructive and very helpful. John, oh sorry, anybody, any questions, comments on what Vicky said? Are we good? Okay. John,
Yep.
audit and risk.
Yeah, just to pick up again, I think the summary report there gives the main points. I think the things to highlight, very good draft, I think, of the annual report this year. That's progressing very, very well. Very pleased with how that's going. And I think overall the committee was very positive about that. And obviously that is a big step change, I suppose, from the challenge we had last year to get that done and be much closer to being concluded. Everything else more or less on schedule, as you can see there. The interesting thing for me is the work of the three chairs of the three audit committees of the organisations coming together, which I think is actually getting quite a bit of momentum. It was interesting, it doesn't specifically state it there, but I think, David, you picked it up when we looked at the slides, and others did, that the three organisations have looked at risk from a slightly different angle. We've been much more organisational in terms of looking at our own risk register as it impacts us, whereas the other two organisations are very much focused on system aspects, although there are some overlaps. So what we've done is we've asked the executive to go away and have a look to see if there are any gaps in our risk register if we were to take more of a system approach. And I believe the other two audit committees are doing it the other way around, actually, going away and asking whether things that they should have looked at from an organisational point of view. And then we'll come back again and look for where the overlaps are on the big risks for the three organisations coming together, just to make sure we're covering off during the transition phase. And comfort. And there were some quite early sort of identification of areas of similarity. Everyone's worried about cyber risk. Everybody's worried about data security. And then things like workforce supply and capacity issues are on everybody's radar, if you like. But there are some other areas that we might want to revisit and maybe bring onto that list. We'll probably end up with about 5 common large areas of risk across the three organisations as they come together that we might want to consider and focus on. And then the other minor areas will continue to be sub-risks, if you like, as things move. But very positive, I think, activity. And again, the team's working very well together across the three organisations to make this happen.
No, very good, very good. Sorry.
Yeah, if I could just I think that's really encouraging, John, to hear that the committees have come together. I think one issue, just to flesh out, and I think for us as HEE, is our accountabilities up to the change over the next year, and have absolute clarity as to what we're managing and make sure that the system understands what it is we're managing. I think those accountability bits, I think it's really critical for us as an organisation.
Yeah. And I think the other thing is that David and I have discussed it, and I know we've discussed it with us, of course, is how do we keep some legacy during the transition period, the handover, so that we don't lose institutional memory across the governance process, if you like.
Callum.
Just a quick addition, actually, I don't think it's referred to in the note there, but we also did look at the forthcoming plan for internal audit for the year ahead, and alongside the usual blend of things, we've made sure that they've picked up on the governance of transition, and also a piece of work around programme decommissioning as well. So I think that's all pretty well set for the year ahead. But we'll, we know this is a very dynamic year, and internal impact can be flexed if necessary. So yeah, it's all about as we go.
Very good. And the gremlins that got in the system in the production of the annual report last year, that you feel relatively comfortable that they're all going to be sorted?
At the moment, I don't.
Okay.
Why
are you asking Nicola? You were financial issues.
Well, okay, to the financial issues. Oh yeah, we've dealt with that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
It's fine at the moment.
The words are fine, yeah, it was the bloody money that I was getting clarity about. You're all right.
It's good, yeah, no, we had a classification issue around staff costs before. That was something we looked into, resolved last year.
Yeah, good, all right, brilliant, thank you. John, thanks, thanks for that. Again, I think that work between the respective audit committees, I think is really, really good. And Soraya's pointed out, you know, we are a continuing organisation since the 1st of March 2023, and we need to discharge our responsibilities, so we'll continue to do that. And then the quality committee had its first meeting on the 25th of April. I'm not sure who's there. Okay, do you want to try to go, sorry?
I mean, it's as read. I think the first committee very much was examining the terms of reference, and I suppose the area where we need more work to look across the other committees is where there's going to be overlap around continuous improvement in quality and the way in which we operate, and how is that being discharged, and which committee needs to drill down and which committees have an overview. Apart from that, it was a really good first meeting actually, and we've asked for a detailed look at what is our quality framework and what are the metrics around that for education training.
Anybody, you want to say anything?
No, just that we're working with colleagues in HEE and looking at the read across, slightly different quality committee approach there. But there are lots of other points of contact that we are already engaged in, and it's whether we can use them efficiently, I think, is the way forward.
I'd make the same argument that an observation that John has just made about where there's difference and where there's similarities and how they connect really. And, right, okay. That I think gets us to the end.
When do we do remuneration committee? Do we do that under private board?
All right. So that moves us on to the maternity education and training review. So at this point, I'll hand over to David and Mark to take us through this.
Thank you. I'm going to do this in two bits. One is I want to just take you through where we're getting to in HEE around the education side of recent maternity reviews and our focus on an education training and development lens. And then we're looking to have Sophie as a trainee in Ossicaini and hopefully Elspeth, who's a first year student midwife, to give us some of their real experience today.
David, sorry to interrupt you. It's rude of me to do that, but Sophie, why don't you introduce yourself and say who you are and just say a little bit about where you're at in your career and whoever you're smiling to over there. You introduce yourself, and then if we've got Elspeth, I'll ask Elspeth to introduce herself if you've got to. Matt.
She hasn't dialed in as yet. So
okay, all right. This might not work actually, but and then I'll hand the back to you. Sophie.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sophie White, and thank you very much for coming on today. So I'm an ST6 trainee in the southwest of England in Chinese, and I've been really fortunate and I've been in a very privileged position to have made the most of all the flexible working opportunities that HEE have created over the last 10 years. So for the last 18 months, I've worked in a fellow role both here and a separate fellow role at the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. And then I've come back to clinical practice fairly recently, so I do feel a little bit fraudulent in commenting on culture. But since coming back, I've come back in a less than full-time role, which has allowed me to continue at the college as well in my role there. So I think that's one thing I did just want to say is that 10 years ago, this wouldn't have been possible for me to have done an out-of-programme experience, worked less than full-time, taken on other roles, learned about leadership and management, but nowadays that's brilliant.
Thanks, Sophie. I look forward to your comments. Graham.
Yeah, well, I'm at the opposite end of my career. What I would describe as the twilight of my career. So I'm Graham Dumas. I'm the regional postgraduate dean for the southeast of England, and I've been working as a doctor in the NHS for 42 years as a general physician in the hospital in Western Sussex for most of that time. And then the last 7 years as I've been privilege to be postgraduate dean for the South East. It's a fantastic job working for HEE. It's been marvellous, the best bit of my career. That aside, the reason I'm here today is because I'm the liaison dean for obstetrics and gynecology. So I'm the HEE senior doctor who is directly involved with workforce issues, particularly the Royal College of Obstetrics and Gynecology.
But if not, well, I've got some feedback from her that I can talk through with her about her experiences, and of course, so.
Okay. Right, now, over to you.
Thank you. Okay, the board will be aware of the publication of two opinion reports, one in December 20 and one in March 22. And we had a discussion at our April board briefing on them. And the context of them is some very horrific accounts of the experience of women in Mid Staffordshire. And the report really focuses on some of the poor experiences that people have. And what the culmination of that has been is the report has many actions. There are 15 local actions for learning, which are largely for trusts to carry forward. And then there are a further number of immediate and essential actions for systems to take forward as well. Now, in terms of our input, we're obviously working with other organisations to input into all of the activities, but we're only lead on one of them in terms of a lead name, and that's around the development of the workforce modelling tool that the RCOG are developing to look at future workforce demand in the medical pipeline. We've been working through our Maternity Transformation Programme Board, which is currently HEE hosted, and it's multi-partnered, so we have the RCOG, NMC, RCM, NHSC and I, and we have service user input into that. Really to understand the issues, recommendations arising from the reports, and understand who's leading which parts of the world and what we should do better together, how we can get a cohesive plan to deliver all of the objectives as one, and how we'll work on mapping the objectives for individual organisations into one place, so we have one integrated report and activity plan going forward. We thought it would be useful for us to take a slightly different approach to reviewing these reports, and given the fact there'll be further reports coming out this year with Nottingham, etc., and East Kent, we wanted to really get underneath some of the issues that aren't really given precedence in Ockenden around education and training. So we've taken the report with partner colleagues to look through an education lens at some of the issues that might have an impact on the culture of maternity services, if that culture starts in training and starts in the curriculum being delivered. So we wanted to make sure that the curriculum being delivered at the moment are taking account of the many maternity reviews that have happened over time, and that there are processes in place for formal reviews of that to make sure education and training is up to date with findings and are providing the best safe practice experience for people in all professions that are affected by these reviews and reports. We're also trying to work through with these groups around how we can think about the experience of trainees and students in training at the moment to inform our plans for next stages. And we think that we could do a bit more in terms of engagement into our maternity transformation programme plans to hear that voice in time and to use that voice in terms of helping us design our future plans, programmes and activities. The report that you've got today starts this process of doing that. So one of the first things we know we've got to do is get integration of all of the workforce plans associated with maternity services that currently happen in probably at least 3 different places. And we've got agreement now that we'll develop one integrated maternity workforce board that will be co-chaired between NHSE and I and ourselves at this stage, that will pull together all of the plans, activities and actions by all the organisations into one place and get a sense of prioritisation, ownership, and we'll be able to deliver on that. So governance is one of the first recommendations. We've also developed recommendations on how we can further support the NMC in rollout of the Future Midwife programme, because it's slightly inconsistent now through the regions in terms of the extent it's got through into training, but also supporting the RCOG in particular how we can think about joint training between midwifery students, medical students and medical trainees, because that's been some of the criticisms on many reports around multidisciplinary training and multidisciplinary working when in practice. So that's a common theme around culture, and therefore we need to think about how we address that through education, training and development. And we're also looking at what's our role as HEE in ensuring we can strengthen the quality role and get a better focus through regional infrastructure as they work with maternity units, so that we're picking up and listening to all issues as well as the softer issues in real time in all of these places. So there's some recommendation in the report in that. We are pretty much hand in hand with, I say, the NMC, RCM, RCOG and NHSE and I in the development of the plans, and they're all cited on and signed up to the recommendations of the plan that's in your papers today. And there will be further iterations of this when we have the roundtable that we're going to have, and we're also going to have a workshop relatively soon to understand the gap analysis that each organisation has done against upcoming recommendations through an education lens to make sure that we're aligned and consistent in that. So that's all I want to say about the actual report at this stage. I was going to ask Mark if he had any comments and Graham any comments, and then questions on that before we go to the experience session.
Thank you.
Of course, thank you. And just say I'm sure board members have read the report and probably join me in the thoughts with the families actually in terms of their experiences, but also their kind of advocacy and fortitude with other families in terms of raising these concerns. And whilst this obviously related to the SAF organisation, I think we've seen this as a wider system focus and recognising our role as HEE. But I'd also like again to thank our students, learners and trainees, because their voice is fundamentally important, both in terms of the improvement journey of the organisations we're currently working with, which has been highlighted in the report, but also importantly raising any of their concerns with us that we're able to take into that. It's really important that we can see those voices of the students and learners quite critically in terms of how we approach policy design, but also importantly operationally supporting the service. David's rightly pointed out a great deal of work that is in play across the team in maternity. And whilst we understand that services are often very complex in their delivery, actually this is about obstetricians, midwives, service leaders, managers all working together to deliver good outcomes, and that is our experience. But obviously what we've tried to do, as David rightly pointed out, is take a step back and put a fresh lens on this to really understand truly whether some of these actions are making the improvements that we need to do, again, alongside our colleagues within NHS England, improvement and importantly, a number of our stakeholders. However, I think it's really important to reflect actually our students, learners and trainees have been phenomenal during the last 2.5 years during their training experience, and through various mechanisms through Wendy's team, my maternity transformation programme, we have a great deal of opportunity to listen to their experiences of training and also adjust and refine how we deliver some of our programs. So I'm really grateful for the time both Elspeth and Sophie spent with us to share their experiences, and to David, Navina, Wendy and myself thought that this conversation at board, learning and listening to their experiences of training and reflections on both Ockenden and other reports, I thought was really valuable to get into some of the kind of the richness and the grit that we need to around some of the approaches that are outlined in this paper. So I'm probably at this stage, I know Elspeth unfortunately isn't able to log in, but Elspeth and I spoke with Sir David yesterday, and I've got a detailed account which I'll hopefully have an opportunity to talk through her experiences a bit in a moment. But I wondered whether at this point, Sir David, we to ask Graham and Sophie to perhaps talk through their reflections.
Yeah. Do you just want to introduce
Seema? Hi, Seema.
Hello, good morning. I'm really sorry I can't be with you. I'm the Deputy Lead Midwife at HEE. Thank you for inviting me.
Brilliant. Welcome, Seema.
Good that you've been able to join. So the technology does work. Well done, guys. One of the two that we're after, but great.
Yeah, well, much of what I would want to say has already been stated or is in the paper. I think there are two things that I want to observe, and I'm not an obstetrician, so I can speak relatively freely, it's fair to say. One of the main issues is around culture in departments, in maternity departments, particularly in the acute obstetric unit where babies are delivered. And this is because they will see the tension between two slightly autonomous groups. So midwives are trained to be autonomous to the extent practitioners have to make decisions, are used to making decisions at very short notice and a lot of pressure about what's best for the mother and baby. And at the same time, in those departments, you've got often very junior, very inexperienced young doctors who may or may not have enough insight and familiarity with midwives' experience to realise that they're working with very experienced colleagues. And that can create real tension, because I think it's fair to say doctors are used to being the decision makers in acute situations. And yet here is a situation where often it's the opposite way around, where they need to listen and be guided. So that's one of the reasons I think why there is a tension in many departments which leads to a bad culture, essentially. And the second part of that is that we're not very good in healthcare at making sure that we get the feedback from how colleagues are behaving and actually acting on it. We're quite good at getting the feedback, but it doesn't always translate into doing something about it. So I would bet in most obstetric units where there are problems, 90% of people working there know what the cause of the problem is, even though it hasn't been dealt with. So for me, those are the two things. How can we look at culture? How can we have a more flat hierarchy in those departments so that everybody is comfortable to challenge bad behaviour and do something about it? And we know that one of the ways we can do that, I think, is by learning and training together from a very early stage. It's got to be right from the start of medical school. It's too late if you leave it until medical students qualify as doctors. It's got to be natural, it's got to be embedded, it's got to be the way that you do things. So really, those are my two main observations, I would say.
Really helpful, Graham. I think fundamental observations, and I know Sophie will probably pick up on this because that's an important part of the conversation that we had yesterday as well, we're just preparing for today. So as David F said, if we just open up the conversation across the board at this point, and then Sophie, I'll bring you in and you can add to that, and then we can have a conversation with you about your experience and reflections. So, Soraya, please.
I think really to ask and stress the importance of trainee feedback, and that's at every level, and actually then triangulating that with other data sets that we may be getting through our Freedom to Speak Up Guardians. And I think, quite frankly, culture is so critical. I have a vested interest. My daughter was a trainee, she's now a consultant. And some of the information that one picks up, none of this was of any surprise, and different units I think gave her very different experiences. She was a flexible trainee, so obviously a real fan of HEE and all of that. But the culture piece is so critical. So I don't know whether with some of the round table stuff, you could really start to tease out actually what information are these units using, and perhaps for HEE through our regional deans, we almost have some sort of heat map to say actually these are the areas we really do need to focus on, plus learning between different units, because I think that is also critical. Some units, despite having an enormous amount of pressure, and I think it is down to the culture of that organisation and the way teams are working and what the leadership is doing, are able to manage that in difficult circumstances. So I think this is a real opportunity, and I think that obviously the patient carer voice is critical in that as well. But I think really to stress that the trainee voice from our different students is critical, medical and midwifery.
Thank you, Sarai. Wendy?
Yes, so just to declare an interest, I'm an obstetrician and gynaecologist by background, and I was on my college council for what felt like decades, and I was vice president of my college at the time, which is, I finished being VP in 2012, so a long while ago. We were very aware of the cultural issues. The hierarchy is really strong, and those tribal hierarchies are part of the culture that makes us really good in this country at delivering babies as well, but it also then gets in the way, as we've seen, in the extraordinary and awful outcomes detailed by Donna. So I think there's a role for people like us to sit in the middle of that and to be the broker of change. I do think there are some real structural challenges within the career pathways, and I'm sure Sophie will talk about some of the challenges there. But I think perhaps my reflection is we've expected other people to do the change that we know is necessary without giving them both the tools and the environment in which that change is possible. And I think that's where the joint working that we've done so far, discussing how we will train together more actively, is going to be really important. And the undergraduate challenge is not to be underestimated, with all of the medical schools having not only different curricula, but different times at which they do obs and gynae. Some of them don't do obs and gynae, they do women's health. We speak different languages between midwifery and obstetrics. Midwives call it maternity, we call it obstetrics. So these are not insignificant cultural barriers, but I think if we can't get through them, then we shouldn't expect our college colleagues to do it on their own. So for me, it's about the joint work that we've been doing. It's about having joint fellowships, which I think have been extraordinarily successful. And it's partly thanks to the character and personality of the fellows that we've had, including Sophie, but it's also actually an effort to say we need to work with, rather than say we want this change to happen.
Okay. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you. So, I mean, it seems like a positive way forward on a desperately sad situation. I guess my slight concern is that clearly we're headlining on culture, and culture is what we need to deal with. And I wonder whether we just need to get a bit more under the skin and understand how are we going to change culture. Because looking at these lists, these recommendations, the one that really seems to be addressing culture is about joint work training opportunities. But I think that in itself isn't enough, because I was involved in the programme, nothing to do with gynae, but to do with research, where we trained in research nurses, doctors, AHPs, and it was actually like mixing oil and water, and actually I think we made the situation worse, because people actually learned what made them different from each other, and it was and I think it was a negative experience. And we've got to work out how to make mayonnaise, not to make oil and water, and that takes energy. You don't just shove people in the room and get mayonnaise, you have to do something. And so I'm quite interested in how do we help medical schools make mayonnaise. And then my other, moving away from the culinary one, my other bit is as well, how do we learn for the rest of our training and education for other disciplines? Because we may have a particular problem here, but it's a problem that we would also recognise, I think, across medicine. Jeremy Hunt said something about it at the weekend, and therefore it's something that we've got to be doing all the way across medicine. How are we spreading this everywhere in all of our clinical services? Thank you.
I think it's not just about initial training as well, isn't it? I think some of the cultural issues, one of the issues, and I hope we can come to this later, is what are the responsibilities of our employers? Because cultures are created by employers and by you. Yes, we have a role. Yes, there's lots we can do. But actually, I think it speaks to Graham's point about it's very difficult to assess culture from the outside of an organisation, but those people that are inside the organisation will know what the culture is. And actually, whether people will speak truth to power, wherever that power is distributed, strikes me as being right at the heart of the culture and about safe systems. And too often, whether it's the Morecambe Bay report and Bill Kirkhope, Ockenden 1, Ockenden 2, and I don't know what's going to come out of the Nottingham or East Kent, but I would hazard a guess that there'll be something about culture, and therefore I think there is something about what are employees' responsibilities, because that's where the pre-qualification training is going to take place. I think there's probably issues that we need to consider in terms of subsequent. I mean, to Graham's point about his length of experience, without making wild guesses at age, you've probably got another 20 odd years to work, and therefore, actually, some of this is about not just how we educate new students, people at graduate level, but how do we educate people who are already in the system? And for me, that's one of the frustrations in relation to what have we learned since Morecambe Bay, and how is that beginning to translate into what we do? And I ran CQC, and I don't think I got everything right when I did that job. And I think it's important that we're able to say we haven't got things right, because that's a platform on which you can then begin to actually make improvements and put things right. But John Leyland, please.
Yeah, just on that, I mean, as a Vice Chancellor of a university, trust me, I know all about cultures and structures and hierarchies and perceived specialisms. I have about 7,000 special people who are all different from each other working for me. I think one of the interesting things is, and I think fundamentally, yes, you can change the training approaches, you can change the way in which the approach is taken. But fundamentally, I also believe that there needs to be some pilots, or there needs some places where the change can be seen to have been made unsuccessful if you really want to change things in what is it's a profession. You're right, David. The institutions that we're talking about, do have cultures, but a lot of that culture comes from the professionals and the people that work in them. Many of those people will work in many organisations during their career. It's a bit like academics. If they haven't worked for 3 or 4 universities during their career, it's unusual, shall we say. So I do think there's something around enabling people or giving some people the freedom or the opportunity to be a pilot for change and enabling and seeing that change as being successful, because people are very worried about change, particularly something which is so, you know, the legacy is significant here.
The mindset and being open to change is the first part of being able to change, isn't it? If people who are frightened or in denial or whatever range of emotions, then change becomes difficult.
Yeah, it's the report that we've done is and the other culture work. It's not the start of the culture work. And there is a group that's cross ALBs and reaches out on culture. And some of the work that's implemented, it's run the program called Each Baby Counts Learn Support, and that's being driven and led by the LCOG. And the purpose of the program is absolutely to help maternity units build the right culture, behaviours and conditions to enable effective clinical escalation. And it's doing 16 pilots at the moment due to report imminently. And the purpose of this is around clinical escalation, psychological safety for staff, a structured way of improving communication and behaviour change, and that's for current workforce. So we'll see what the pilots are suggesting for that, and how we can build on that and take that into our own work as well.
And that picks up on workplace cultures, it picks up on the point that Andrew is making. And do you think that's prominent enough in the recommendations?
No, I think we need to get feedback from the pilots and start feeding that back into our own recommendations. So this will be iterative through the workshop and the roundtable that I have.
So is it worth, of these, 6 recommendations that are made here that we're being asked to support?
I think there'll be further recommendations from the roundtable that will be in fact.
Okay, so this work is iterative. Okay, all right, thanks. While we're still on the report, and before I bring Sophie in and Mark to speak for Elspeth, are there any other questions from colleagues on the report that David's presented? Could I ask, as you iterate then, that we get some sense of timetable and timescale, please? I'm happy to accept the recommendation to support these with a qualification that I think has just come from Andrew's point. But actually, I want a sense of how quickly this is going to get done. My personal view, as long as I chair this board, is I still feel deeply, deeply concerned that the lessons that came out of the death of Joshua Titcombe, that was captured in the report that came out at Morecambe Bay, has been repeated in Ockenden 1 and 2, and I suspect will get repeated again. And that, for me, is why that culture is enduring and what it is that we need to do, and whether that's changes to undergraduate education, no matter how difficult that is. I think there just has to be some sense of urgency amongst our stakeholders that this isn't an academic debate. This is a debate about clinical safety of mothers and babies.
Sorry, I'm meant to bring Patrick in just about e-learning.
Just to bring the board aware that the TEL team through e-learning for healthcare have now produced an easy access maternity e-learning package, which is basically has been structured around the Ockenden immediate and essential actions, so that we've got 100 learning resources all together through e-learning for healthcare. So that's an immediate action that has been available since Monday.
And are they individual learning? So do I, as a professional or a manager, go on and I learn by myself, or do I learn with others?
It's individual learning, but you can do it as a group as well. So it's how you want to use the packages that are available. But clearly we can add to that, including the human resources, human factors training that can go on.
That's tremendous, Patrick. Thank you. Are we content on the report that David has got? Okay. Mark, do you want to be a proxy for Elspeth's words?
Thanks, Sir David, and I'm sure they'll be reflected also with Sophie, who joined us yesterday. it was a really good debate. Thank you, Paul, for that, and your kind of steers and questions, always extremely valuable. I think Elspeth, as a first-year student midwife, we were really reflective yesterday, not only of her experiences over the last 12 months, but also directly looking at the questions around Ockenden and the influence around education and training. Elspeth is at Northampton University, and is actually one of the first, is one of the universities going through the Future Midwife Standards programme, which is obviously a really important structural underpinning change in relation to the preparation of the programme. But Elspeth really reflected on some of the kind of current operational pressures that the maternity services are experiencing and the impact that has on teaching and learning. And Elspeth was very reflective of what that means sometimes in terms of the culture of learning that might exist in individual areas and departments. And there are, in some cases, and we see this through our surveys, that more widely among student midwives, that there is a greater degree of bullying by registered midwives to student midwives in practice, far greater degree than we see within registered new nurses and student nurses. Issues we picked up directly with the learning systems, but also with our colleagues in NHSE. And some of that is some quite old-fashioned attitudes towards students and learning, and I think that's a really important reflection, that we've got to think about how we're supervising, supporting cultures of learning within individual departments. Was a reflection from Elspeth. And also the kind of relationship that exists between the placement provider and the university about information flows to make sure students were prepared. And again, more work for us to do as an organisation, supporting and helping with those kind of approaches. But without doubt, some of the operational pressures were affecting the learning experience and wider cultural issues within midwifery training. But also an important reflection, I think both Sophie mentioned as well, which is the wider media reporting around current maternity services is without doubt affecting both morale and impact on students, learners and trainees in those environments. But lots of great opportunities around where we could go in terms of action and training, which obviously I'm going to leave to Sophie to talk through, because did a great job explaining them yesterday about the opportunities around job approaches to learning, but also other improvement areas we could take.
Okay, thanks, Mark. So the floor is yours. I think yesterday you shared what your experience of services were, and I think it would be helpful if you could speak to those points again. But then I pushed you, I think, in terms of talking about your experiences of training and what development should take place, because I'd quite like the board then to have a discussion about what more we can do in relation to the experience of training. And you were incredibly thoughtful and reflective and articulate, so no pressure to read a second day. The floor is yours.
But I guess to give you sort of an idea of what it's like currently, I've spoken to the National Trainees Committee at the RCOG and then the trainees in my region. And in the roles that I've done, I've been really fortunate to get an impression of trainees, but also our educators and everybody that we work with. So we've talked a lot about midwives, but of course we're gynecologists as well. So we work with nurses, physios, everybody across the board. And at the minute, the three things that kept getting said to me were fatigue, frustration, and fatigue. So just as we said in the media, one of my colleagues put it to me really beautifully. He said, we've had a massive panic. He said they've oversimplified something that is really complex. And it's meant that we all feel really down and defensive about our profession. Because none of us go to work to feel leave. We go to work together and to create good outcomes for our women. And we look after women from preconception right the way through to the grave. So we're desperate to provide really good service for them. And that's where the frustration comes in. And that frustration is twofold. That's one for staffing, and that is the biggest thing I've heard time and time again. And that's the only thing that people wanted to talk to me about with staffing is leaving. But it's also that we're frustrated that we can't provide, that we also aren't necessarily always able to access the amazing training resources that are out there. So there is brilliant training out there. We have a great education, but staff is preventing us from necessarily engaging in that. And that frustration leads to fear, and that's the fear that we're going to finish our training and not be the amazing clinicians that we should be, and that does worry us. There's also fatigue that just on the way here, I've signed up to an extra couple of shifts over the next few weeks. Now, I said to myself, why am I doing this? Actually, do I want to work more? Not really, but I'm doing it for the safety of the women, but also for my colleagues, because actually as a group, we need to provide a service. And so nobody's pressurising us to do these shifts, but we feel an innate pressure to do it because we don't want to leave it uncovered. And I think it's not just within doctors, it's also that we feel the pressures that midwives are under, we feel the pressures that nurses are under, because we obviously impact on each other. So this weekend I was on call and actually had a lovely weekend, but that's not the normal. And the normal is that we have many women coming over for induction. So that's when we've said to them, there's a really good reason that we need to deliver your baby early, and we bring them in this process that can take 3 to 5 days. So it's quite a stressful, difficult time for women. And the problem is for them to come over to labelled, you need midwives to look after them. And quite often, despite the fact we've had a massive surge in the numbers, on the floor we're chronically short. And the problem is those women, as an obstetrician, I have to then go to them and say, I'm really sorry that we haven't brought you over to labelled. But they said, for a few days ago in clinic, you were telling me how urgent it was that you delivered my baby, and now you're not doing it. And that creates huge pressures for patients and for staff. So I think working together is something which we are very fortunate to be doing. And I think in terms of culture, it's really difficult because there is coming up time and time again, repeatedly in reports. And I definitely don't want to be sat here in 10 years still talking about culture and having not made leeway. But I do think there are definite glimmers of hope. I think when you said about employers, that is probably a big factor because I currently work in an organisation where everybody works brilliantly together. It's progressive and we all work as a team. Part of that might be because over the last 12 years I've worked there many times. And actually, when you said about us all working together, the nurses that were newly qualified when I was a foundation doctor and now the senior sisters on the wards around the hospital where I go, the midwives that qualified in me, they're now the matrons. And actually that's worked really well because we've sort of grown up together. So we know what each other can do. We've had our troubled times all together and that works really nicely. So in some ways it's great that we rotate because we see all the different ways, but equally it's good that we go back to places because then we do work together. And we do learn together because we have multi-professional training, but actually that probably does need a lot more behind it. But in terms of sort of employers, it's very strange that I can be working somewhere currently that is fantastic, but I have rotated through here and abroad places that maybe didn't have quite such a good culture, and that suggests that maybe there is some element there in the organisation as opposed to just the training. But I think two things that I'd really like to talk about are the staffing levels and our access to training opportunities, which we have lots of ideas on.
Okay. And we just say a bit more about multidisciplinary training, and given, you know, from your undergraduate days through to where you are, and I know you're going to go on and study further, could you just share with the board some of your reflections on where it's worked, where it exists, where it doesn't exist, what improvements might be made in relation to this? Because I think Graham was reflecting, you know, there is this adage, it's been around for a long time, that if people train together, they work better together. Yet we know the competition to create the space for people to come together, whether that's a logistic pressure or it's a scheduling pressure, whatever it is. Just be interested in your reflections.
So at medical school, we did have times where we trained with other students in different areas. I don't ever remember doing any training with midwife students. However, there are programmes currently, for example, in Oxford, where they have undergraduate medical students with midwifery students working together. Now, of course, they might not be the obstetricians of the future, but actually it doesn't matter, because if they're a respiratory consultant of the future, they will come and see our cystic fibrosis women. So it doesn't actually matter if it's not directly correlating in the future. So I think that's really important, because if we all work together at the very, very start, you stop those structural barriers coming into play. Because more importantly, you create friendships, and if you've got friendships, you're not going to compete with your friends. And then once we went into foundation training, I think that was probably generically rotated around everywhere. Again, we had a lot of training, and we had a lot of teaching to be delivered by nurses, midwives, physios, and again that really helps because it shows you specialists in different areas. So as a junior doctor, you think, oh, I know a tiny bit about quite a lot, but I don't know much about a lot, whereas they do, so I'm going to defer to them at all costs. and I think that was really helpful. We probably could have more of it. I think once I entered into obs and gynae training, our ability to learn together is slightly dwindled because it's quite difficult in that we're postgraduate doctors, so we're working. We don't go to lectures. We don't go in the way that Elspeth was talking. You know, she gets to go to lectures. We don't have that, so you can't put the two together in the same way anymore. But we do have multi-professional training days, which work really nicely because emergency situations, just as all these reports say, are based on us working together. So if we simulate the scenarios together and train together, then that works really well. And lots of funding related to simulation, and we've been doing a lot as doctors together, but we're now trying to expand that to ensure that we've got everybody coming in. The problem is it all boils down to the availability of staff. So we can create the most amazing programs, but actually a few weeks ago we had an amazing program ready to go with simulation, but we didn't have any doctors and we didn't have the anaesthetists to go, and the midwives have been called back to the ward. So of course clinical workload takes priority, and then training takes a second sort of to that, and then of course you haven't put all those people together. So it's about allowing those opportunities that are there, but it's about allowing us to go to them.
And yesterday, you made a reflection on some colleagues that you've got working in London did have that opportunity on a Fridays to come together to train. But your lived reality at the minute is the commitment to service and delivery is such, reflected probably in you accepting additional shifts, means that that service pressure crowds out the opportunity to undertake the training. It plays to your point about the sufficiency of staff.
Yeah, and it's really difficult, isn't it? Because the grass is always green, but there's never going to be a perfect way. But for example, training and teaching, some places are teaching afternoons, but they're in places that are slightly better staffed than we are. So in regions where you have lower levels of staffing or lower numbers of trainees, it's harder to release them because by the time you've covered the nights, the days, etc., then it's harder to release them for generic training. So it would be nice if we could level up that teaching, and also whether there's a way of, instead of it being region-led, whether now with teams, there's no reason that we can't all share the same teaching. There's no reason that people in London can have amazing teaching from professors and teaching hospitals that then, for example, rural areas can't be added to. So that would be fantastic. But equally, as I was saying yesterday, where I'm saying colleagues in London potentially have better lecture teaching, we were talking about the fact that in the southwest we see double the number of births per trainee than there is in the northeast. So actually, maybe I get better exposure to clinical training. So it does all lead to the fact that the grass is greener, but it's about looking at all those different nuances, looking at our distribution and working out how we can try and get equity between them.
They're not binary choices, are they, between the kind of academic work and the practical work? And this might play to the point that I think both Wendy and Graham have mentioned about what are our responsibilities to actually begin to shape this. I think there's a lot of service provision and service design where we're limited on, but actually, I think Soraya was making this point, the voice of those of you that are going through training, beginning to inform what we do and how we do it is important. One of my questions to both of you yesterday was what penetration has Kirkup from Morecambe Bay, Ockenden 1, Ockenden 2 had in relation to your lived experience? And that was a question both to undergraduate midwifery as well as to, it kind of overlaps with your career, I think, the first Kirkup report, I guess. But will you just say a little bit about your experience of just how visible Ockenden and Kirkup have been in relation to your experience of education and training. You talked earlier on part of the frustration and the defensiveness that can create, and I think that's one of the conundrums in a sense. I understand that emotion, but it goes back to if we are going to improve, then we need to accept that there is a need to improve. Otherwise it doesn't. And I'm just interested in really opening that up and seeing what, from an education perspective, health education in England might contribute to improvements in that area.
I think there's, yes, I mean, I don't think anybody working in obs and gynae could have not known about Donald Ockenden's report. And We have a lot of discussion about it. It comes up in our risk management meetings, our audit meetings, our CTG meetings. We're constantly learning all about it. But again, it's our ability to attend those meetings, which means that some people don't quite get the same training. But I think in terms of the impact upon us, well, we all want to improve, and we're all there learning. The trainees we're training, we want to learn from those around us. So there's an absolute willingness to change and a definite desire to improve the situation. I think one thing that we probably could do is change the narrative around it. So what we haven't been able to do is, I think, with the media narrative of it, that is very anti-doctor and midwife, it can be perceived to be. But I think that's the point where we can change that, and we can just counterbalance that and say, all those terrible cases, which we are of course going to learn from, there were millions of babies that were born in amazing circumstances with really happy women, and lots of people that had gynae operations that transformed their lives. So it's just ensuring that. It's also about getting our language right as well, because, for example, the other day I saw a lady in gynecology clinic, and the nurse said, "This is one of our student doctors," and I didn't correct her. But of course, then the lady at the end of the appointment said to me, "Oh, good luck in your learning." And I was like, anyway, she came a week later and I was the surgeon doing an operation. Unfortunately, she saw the funny side of it, but actually that could get you in quite hot water. So we do need to be quite careful about the way we say, and actually something that's been doing obviously around 10 years, you're reasonably good at your job by now. And so we are providing service for not just people that are there leeching from it. And I think that is something that we sort of need to have a sort of an understanding of. But in terms of how it affects us day to day, I think one of my jobs at the college is we've just done a census of the country of workforce, but in that we looked at how people have spent their money, and I looked at the preliminary findings of that, and it's very top heavy. So the money has been spent on a lot to do with consultant PAs, and it's fairly top heavy, and it would just take quite a long time for that to filter down and for trainees to feel those changes. So I think it's ensuring that we ring fence and we ensure that there is a direct entry into training, because otherwise we don't see it for quite a long time. Now, of course, more consultant PAs in teaching, fetal monitoring, all the different things that have happened so far will positively impact on us, but it's quite hard for people to see that in the longer term.
So the important point is if additional money is going to come in over this next period of time, that your reflections are pretty important, I think. Really very, very helpful. Thank you for being so fluent and articulate. Can I open up? I've hogged it, but partly because we'd covered some of this territory yesterday, and I know that Sophie has reflected and thought on that. But
yeah, just to reflect on some of the things that Sophie said around the sort of equity and distribution. The board will know that we're involved in a really big piece of work jointly with colleagues in NHSEI around the distribution of training resources. And one of the specialties that is going first is obstetrics and gynecology. And it's a really important point about levelling up. Now in obstetrics and gynecology, we do have an investment to increase the number of trainees. It's only a 1-year investment, but we're negotiating hard for it to be sustained. However, I think one of the challenges for us is levelling up for the service needs to be the same as levelling up with education and training, and we're working on what that match-up is going to look like. And Sophie and the college have been, college work has been really helpful in that. But I think this is one of our responses. It's part of the Health Inequalities white paper, which Mark alluded to in his report. It is a big part of how we address health inequalities. But it's not without its challenges in terms of the consequences and the mitigation. But it is partly based on what Sophie was describing.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Sorry, which again is an observation I've seen somewhere else, and it's probably again too difficult to change because it's never been changed. But because medical education, health education is quite a long process, actually the comment you made about the day that you're a trainee and the day that you're not is a very binary transition, and people understanding that actually people go through stages. We're literally doing it at my university at the moment, where we're doing teaching associates. We've had to come up with initial teaching associates, mature senior teaching associates and lead teaching associates, just to start to get some recognition that actually after 1 or 2 years of being involved, they are capable of doing certain things very, very well indeed. And we need to recognise that there is some progression through that process. And health and medical education is a long process.
Okay, anybody else? If you could change one thing about your education and training, what would it be?
A number of them. So I think in terms of numbers over the time I've been in Northern Ireland, which isn't actually that long, but there have been huge positives. So just as I mentioned earlier, we can go lessons we find without having to have a care responsibility. We can take out of programme experiences, we can work flexibly. All those things are brilliant. And they've been reflected in our attrition. In 2013, it was 12%, it's now 3%. So something is working, but we're not feeling that on the ground. So we're still very short-staffed. And we think, well, why is that? And that's because, of course, if we make people less than full-time, we allow them to take duties, who's going to backfill them? So the problem is that we need to relook at our workforce modelling to ensure that we essentially overstaff, because each body and each training member doesn't equate to a full-time working equivalent. And that's our biggest problem, because that's what blocks us having access to the training opportunities which are out there, which we really need. So that would be the main thing that we would change, because if we could do that, then it's things like Hobson Riding isn't an insignificant undertaking, it is 2 professions in one. So we have to learn in both. And just as I was saying the other day, because I've been a bit bored because I want to be a gynaecologist, so I'm going on to do subspecialty training, which is another 3 years, because I couldn't do what I needed to do to become a gynaecologist within the confines of our 7 years. But it's things like a pivotal points from ST2 to 3, where you go from being a junior doctor sort of to a more senior obstetrician. That's a really important point, because that's good where you go from being somebody that's sort of learning to do cesareans to the person that doing more that does the cesarean without, direct supervision. Somebody is at home covering you. And that's a really important job. And people are doing that in their mid-20s. They're taking on massive responsibility. And they're expected to learn how to do that whilst providing service. Whereas I arrived at my institute, just taught the pivotal point training, where there's things like that we could factor in if we just had a little staffing level. Actually, probably there that we could do it to what it is now. And there's sort of a lot of other little things like that we have ideas that would be great.
So if that's your first to an improvement, can I invite you into what would be the wish in the education and training sphere? Because I can actually represent that view in other places, but I have no hands on any levers to actually do that, whereas we do have hands on lots of levers in relation to education and training. So what would you ask this board to do to improve based on your experience?
So I think probably there's probably no one big thing. There's lots of little things that we do, and these are obviously pertinent to jobs and gynae. There's things like ensuring that with COVID recovery, we obviously have huge waiting lists, but it's also prioritising training within that, which of course we're already doing. But in certain places, there's still not access to private sector operating lists. So that would be one that we could improve. There's the ability to release funds for supervision of training as well. So for example, in the trust I work, it's Foundation Trust. So they actually don't have to follow the recommendation of how many PAs for training. So it's all things like that which would mean we get better access to training. Because also our supervisors and our trainers, they're also tired and they're also trying to do other stuff. So if they have more time ring fence for just training us, then it's time and theatre where we'll actually get to operate, as opposed to watching other people operate just to quickly get these poor women through that have been waiting for a huge amount of time. As I said before, it's also about supernumerary provision. So that's something that we definitely can push forward as an organisation, accepting that we need more relative to what we've got. And then another thing in terms of sort of the training side of things is the way that we train in terms of rotation and consistency. So we're really fortunate in that we rotate because we get really good experience, and that's something that we're talking to midwifery students and nursing students. They say, well, we don't get that insight. We just work in one place in most cases, and that's something that they think potentially would benefit them. And of course, there's pros and cons to it, but the cons are such that we start in our 20s and finish in our mid-40s, and that's the majority of us. There's people on the extremes of that as well. And of course, we all have lives outside of training, and it's just remembering that we're not students that have a 3-year programme. We're people that are doing this for 7 to 15 years that also have other lives around it, and it's trying to ensure that the two interplay nicely, so not commuting 3 hours and things like that, which are quite challenging, and that's something that we change in this setting.
Brilliant, thanks. Okay, so I guess just coming back to the report, would we be clear, David and Mark, that the feedback from both Elspeth, as voiced by Mark, and Sophie's comments are given sufficient weight in the recommendations that we're being asked to support? So I think what I'd probably ask you to do is not respond to that, but take it away as you begin to reshape this. I think there is some obligation on us, having invited Sophie and Elspeth to share their experience, their lived experience, to actually try and accommodate those. And I think it's pretty obvious that Sophie's done a fair amount of work on this and collected this. So this isn't just a personal opinion, it's an informed opinion from those conversations. So I'd ask to do that. I also wonder whether, in terms of the quality of education, we got a report back by Soraya on behalf of the new quality committee as it begins to develop its methodology. I just wonder whether something might be taken up through the new quality committee's workload that actually begins to look at this and almost measures against some of the feedback that you've both given to the new quality committee as well. And then I should have mentioned this earlier, so apologies, David, but Graham said a number of things which were important. Well, everything he said was important, but this issue about, in organisations, and this is more general across management, do we always raise the difficult conversations? Sometimes do we let the difficult conversation ride, and that's how the cultures are shaped? And I think the answer to that is we've all done it. I know I've done it, and I've bitterly regretted it when I've done it as well, because it comes back and bites you later. But I think there's a bit in the report about the freedom to speak up, Guardian, and Simon, you might want to touch on this when we get to your report later. I think the first recourse shouldn't be to go to the freedom to speak up, Guardian. I think the first recourse should be for it to be sorted locally at the point that these issues are raised. That's how you change cultures. And I just ask that we just balance what we're expecting the freedom to speak up Guardians to pick up and run with, and what we'd expect professionals to raise themselves, but also what we'd expect managers to pick up and raise as well, acknowledging that it's hard to do that, but that's where the conversations have got to take place in those levels. But if we've got to the end of that, do you want the last word, Graham? Anything you want to say?
No, I mean, I'm just impressed by the fantastic feedback that we've heard, and to reassure you that the numbers are going up. So there are another 40 trainees additional to the usual recruitment numbers starting this year, and that's that when we say we're confident / optimistic that that will be maintained, because it's about levelling up and then increasing rather than anything else. So I think we can be positive, but it requires every trust to take on board the messages. And I think there are levers we've already got, so we won't accept that a trust chooses not to support consultants to give training time. And I would suggest that if an organisation's put aside a day or a half day for a training session, then they should make arrangements to ensure that it takes place and that it's not impacted by short-term staffing requirements.
I think that's a real dilemma, isn't it, for people running the hospitals at the minute and the community services, is how they trade off service delivery versus.
The good place to do that, they achieve that, and that's the feedback that we get.
But your point about levelling up is those areas where there are fewer people in training, we actually begin to take positive action in relation to that and increase the numbers, which I think from Sophie's very eloquent contribution today is going to be one of the solutions. It's where the numbers and the quality begin to come together. It can't just be about quality, it can't just be about numbers, it's got to be about numbers and quality. Okay. Mark, David, do you want to last word? Either of you two?
No, we'll carry on talking to see how we can, on an ongoing basis, get the student trainee view into the maternity programme sector, because that would really enhance the work we're doing and make sure that we've got some good evidence behind the recommendations that we're making. So we'll carry on talking to you to see how best to do that.
Okay, thanks, colleagues. Can I just thank you very, very much indeed for your honesty, your calmness, your thoughtfulness, and your reflectiveness as well. I think that was, I personally found that an incredibly helpful conversation. So thank you for doing that.
Well, we want to say thank you in return as well, because I think it's very difficult. Trainees, a lot of us, until I worked at HE and the college, I didn't understand the nuances between, and I didn't understand what they did. But once I've realised, I think having said that fact, we now understand all the positive things that have happened, which are huge, but we'd like to help with a few more things. But it's amazing work has happened already, so thank you. It's not training, it's definitely amazing.
Thank you. You only get to open up one problem when you come to You've done it on Obs and Guy. Don't take us into whether people know about what we do. That challenge remains, I have to say. But seriously, thanks very much. You're more than welcome to stay. But good luck in what you're going to do. Thank you. Okay. Right, let's go on to the next item, which, Rob, I think you're going to take this on the strategic framework. I'll let the other one overrun, Rob, because this is more.
Senior one, which is I just want to say a thank you to Seema.
Yeah, go on then.
Apologies, before we go on to the next item, Seema, just to say thank you. I know you've been doing a huge amount of work with the maternity team, particularly from a midwifery perspective, and supporting many of our student midwives, and just to say thank you for being part of the support and developing the session for today.
Yeah, thanks very
much. It's all teamwork, but thank you very much. Thank you.
No, thank you. And I'm sure I speak on behalf of the whole board for the thanking you for your work. So terrific. Thanks, Mark. I can't look in two places at once. It's a challenge of blended meeting. Right, Maestro. I'll let that one run on because I thought it was important. But this is much more of an update rather than an analysis of the issues because of where we are. So that just to explain.
Very happy to.
Yeah. So over to you.
Yeah. So unfortunately, Joe has written an incredibly concise paper. So this makes it easier. Look, it's a real privilege to present this paper. I think the work that's been done is fantastic. I'd like to make a kind of personal thanks to Joe and her team and the wider team that have done this, including the NHS Horizons team, but also colleagues in the department, Skills for Care, and at NHS England. So like I said, it's a concise report, but this is a nice opportunity just to stress a couple of the kind of key issues in it in public. So Joe takes you through the background, which is last summer we were commissioned by the Minister to produce a long-term strategic framework for the health and social care workforce, critically asking us to look at the registered healthcare professionals in adult social care, which is a nice step forward in terms of how we would like to go in the future. It asked us to look at the key drivers of workforce supply and demand over the long term. But one of the things I'm going to stress here is that the purpose is not to have a nice document, it's to lead us to action. So the purpose was to help us identify the main strategic choices, develop a shared and explicit planning assumptions, and identify the actions which we can take using all of our levers at each level of the system. This has now been complemented. The Secretary of State has recently asked NHSE and I and HEE to develop a more detailed workforce strategy that will be informed by the strategic framework, which we will intend to publish in due course. pending normal kind of clearances with the minister, etc. So that's the background. Why have we done a strategic framework? The time lags around workforce development make it really difficult to predict with any precision what individual workforce you're going to need 15 years out. The idea we can do just-in-time supply planning is broadly a fallacy. The uncertainties, particularly around specific service models and funding, make that kind of really hard. And Joe's cone of uncertainty is a visual description of that. The punchline of that is that the best line of sight for the future is the needs of people, both people as patients and people as staff. And that's broadly what this strategic framework will aim to reflect and allow us to bridge back from that future to the actions we take now. The strategic framework is based on extensive literature review, consultation with lots of experts from different backgrounds, but most importantly, over 1,000 conversations with carers, users and staff that's helped us develop it. And what that then does is set out a proposition for what the future of that, the shape of the future workforce is, again critically, so that we can take steps to achieve that future. Not so that we're just saying, here's the future, isn't it nice? But what would we actually have to do now to take us towards that kind of North Star future if we adopt it? The scope of it will cover where we are now, the opportunities and challenges of key drivers, including demographics and technology. But I think that the key element of this is what people have told us they want. So as well as those external drivers, people have said to us what they want in terms of the future shape of care, the future shape of work, and the future shape of education. And I thought it was really telling in the maternity discussion that we went right to the heart of how does education shape that service future. And that's partly what this strategic framework says, that we need to be cognizant of it, because the leadership challenge is to make those three things work in tandem. And Joe uses this phrase to purposefully shape and transform the future workforce. The idea that we're going to be purposeful about it rather than drifting, I think is a key element of this. So although it's a high level report, it intends to set out a range of actions at different levels and support that with tools. And that then takes us on to the next steps. We see this very much as the beginning of a conversation, as the beginning of a kind of a systemic approach to doing long-term planning, not something we do periodically because we're asked to, but because planning in the near term, the medium term and the long term is something we should do consistently. So the next steps are publishing this document when it gets clearance, working on the workforce strategy, using the strategic framework, applying that to pathways like mental health and others, and then linking in with how ICBs and ICSs start to do their 5-year piece. So that's the background to it. We're on the cusp of publishing it. I think it's been a fantastic process as well as content, and I'm happy to take questions if I can.
Thanks, Rob. And I think Sophie's point about less than full-time working is another reflection of the shape of work changing as well, just to make that connection alongside with it. But we've had development sessions on this, you've seen this before, so I think the point here is that it is going through the clearance process, and it's a drafting and editing role that is being undertaken by Joe. I caught up with her yesterday, so I've got a sense of the issues that are occupying her, so she's pretty focused on getting this complete. But any questions, comments to Rob?
I think just a comment first of all to say actually the whole process was actually really well done, and you know, to the whole team, Joe and the rest of the team, the collaborative events, the online events, and the fact that we've also got so many comments now in from the patient's perspective, carers and so forth. Just one question in terms of socialising this with the emerging ICBs. Do we have a plan of how that's going to happen? Is that going to be led presumably by NHS England with our input? Is there a plan there? Because I think that's really going to be a critical stage. Or is this something that might well end up into planning guidance?
So we've certainly got a kind of initial engagement with stakeholders across a range of stakeholders, including ICBs, and as I've described, we're looking what tools we can put that alongside it, because it shouldn't stand alone. And part of that is how do we help shape the ICB 5-year planning guidance that the departments are about to put out? How do we continue to work with our NHSE and my colleagues around set piece planning processes? So we've got the operational planning process now, we've got a multi-year planning process refreshing the LTP, we've got 5-year plans, we've got this, we've got the workforce strategy. The key thing is to make those the same thing. And that at the moment, that's a lot of convening. But let's come back to the earlier comment. This is one of the reasons that the transition to the new organisation has some opportunities, which is to make sure that that happens more consistently and naturally, whilst managing the risks that colleagues have around ensuring we have a focus on the long term, not just the initial recovery stuff. And I think this report is part of that landscape, and we must treat it as a live part of that landscape and think about all those different elements at the same time, including local, regional, national, so it doesn't just become a national statement of, which I don't think will. I think there's a lot of in here that will resonate. You know, the one workforce statements, the anchor institution and healthy community statements. These are all part of a different vision of what a future service means and what future work means. You know, how do we who is our workforce? Is it a local workforce? Is it an economically driving workforce? You know, those are questions that this is brought out from the engagement with the conversations that you described. So
there was an ICB chief executives meeting with trust chief executives session a couple of weeks ago that Mark and Navina attended, and all the attendees did a session on workforce planning where this was explored, along with the point that Rob has made about the strategy later in the year. So I think its passage into currency is about entering the planning guidance, because that's what people pay attention to. Can we note the work? Rob's been heavily involved in this, along with Jazz as well as Joe. So if we know that, and thank Joe. And then once we've got the draft, it will be agreed by the board, so we'll bring it back here. And that might be a special meeting that we need to convene, or something of that nature, just to get this moving. Rob, thank you very much. Simon, so this is our annual report, well, your annual report as the Freedom to Speak Up Guardian to the board, so over to you.
Thank you. Recognising it's a public board, I'm Simon Gregory, I'm Deputy Member Director, and I'm here as your Freedom to Speak Up Guardian. Thank you. This is my second annual report to the board, and I think it's important that it's on the same board agenda as the discussion around maternity services and the Ockenden report, and indeed with thanks to Dave Farrelly, it's referenced in that previous report. It also informs HEE's annual report to Parliament, and Nicola is already working on the incorporation of that. I wanted to start by thanking and celebrating the colleagues that have chosen to speak up. And I think that's important that we do that, and also to thank the Guardians to whom they have spoken up. We have a fabulous team of Guardians, which, as you'll see from the report, is growing. I'm also pleased to report to the board that I am firmly of the view that speaking up is taken very seriously in Health Education England, and I have been supported in this role, in particular by Navina and by Vicky, by Liz as our non-executive director, and I wanted to pass a special thanks to her with her demitting from office today. The support has been fabulous. I'm pleased that Harpreet Sood is going to step into the breach. And also Wendy as my line manager, because there have been times when the Guardian role does take up a disproportionate amount, and I have always been supported in that. It's also been useful in the last year to now be engaged with the People and Culture Committee, who have been both supportive and challenging, and I think that those in equal measure are important for this role. I wanted to update you that we currently have 20 registered Guardians on the National Guardian website. There is a backlog in the training because the Guardian Office has relaunched their training package with a new foundation package, and all Guardians will have to update their training this year. We have diversified the group, and that has borne fruit There is considerable evidence on barriers to speaking up, particularly from those with protected characteristics, not least race, but other protected characteristics as well. And a number of colleagues that have spoken up in the last year have specifically said that they've done so because they saw a guardian in their image or someone that they thought they could speak to. There have been 50 encounters with guardians in the last year, and it is my job is to speak truth to the power that is in this room, and therefore I wish to highlight to you the three significant issues that come up. I do a quarterly report to the Guardian's Office and a quarterly report to the People and Culture Committee, and these issues have been discussed there, and particularly the support I've had from Navina and Vicky, that they are the levels of bullying and harassment issues being raised. I note that is across the NHS, but of course today I'm here to talk to you about HEE. Concerns around discrimination, particularly issues of race and disability, but again, I don't think we can exclude all the protected characteristics in that. And then, especially in the earlier part of the year, there were a lot of people coming to Guardians with HR issues as the first point of call. And that's been something where we've worked very much with Vicky as Director of People and Culture and the People and Culture Committee, who have challenged rightly that the first port of call shouldn't be Freedom to Speak Up Guardians. I know that that is very much an active work in progress. Now, my remit is limited to HEE colleagues, not the Guardian for our trainees or our students, for example. However, we have identified that there are low levels of understanding amongst our learners, and the NET survey has been very important in that. And I wanted to promote here the work that is being done on that, and that was in David's report, but a huge amount of work being done through the quality team and through our regional deans and postgraduate deans, but also the National Guardian's Office and Patrick's team in e-learning for healthcare have created the 3 modules Speak Up, Listen Up and Follow Up. I may have mentioned it once or twice in my report that my duty is also to ensure that the board are up to speed on Freedom to Speak Up, and I would ask you all to commit to undertaking at least the follow-up module. I actually recommend all 3 modules, and it's interesting to see how e-learning has advanced over the 3 modules as well, because I most recently did the follow-up one and it had definitely improved. I also thought, given that we are in a period of transition, it's worth highlighting that I've already been working with Guardians in X and digital, thanks to Soraya's introduction. I actually helped them set up their Guardian system. But we are now working together, forthcoming joint working with the NHS-EI team on this. And I think the key thing is that, just as was said with some of the other items earlier around risk, we're all doing things slightly differently. And we've all got learning from each other. And I think this is an opportunity to create a new Freedom to Speak Up culture in the new NHS England, building on the good that we all have, rather than just moving to one particular model. Although, of course, I would think ours is the best, slightly tongue-in-cheek. I lay my report before you. I'm happy to take any discussions. I hope you will note the 3 particular areas of concern. And again, I would ask for your commitment to undertaking follow-up in order to understand your own role. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Questions, comments, reflections? Andrew, please.
Simon, thank you. Very helpful report. Obviously, what's the right number of cases one doesn't know. I suppose one way of getting a handle on that one is to look at whether the inequality of distribution of cases, if there is any. And when you look at different professional groups, 1 registered nurse midwife, 2 from medical and dental. I mean, I don't quite know what the denominator is. Do you feel that there are hot patches or cold patches which might suggest that either there's a problem or suggest that people are not using your services?
A very, very helpful question, and I have tried to analyse that, but unfortunately the level of feedback that we're getting is not sufficient for me to pick up on that. And indeed the number of cases mean that we have to be quite careful on how we record it, because we're a small enough organisation that I could inadvertently breach confidentiality by identifying. We occasionally identify particular teams where suddenly we're getting a number of cases come up, and that's where I can have a conversation with HR colleagues where I say, I've got a concern in area X. Are you getting any indicators in area X? And that's been quite useful. But the unknown unknowns in Johari Window rather than Donald Rumsfeld, I think are still a limitation. I am part of the cross-system group, partnership group that the Guardian's Office have for arm's length bodies, GMC and MC, etc. And we all grapple with this, and frankly, nobody knows what the right answer is. We have actually set up to look again at the speaking up policy for HE to update it in terms of the latest legal guidance, but also the accessibility. Part of me thinks that we should have high numbers speaking up. Part of me thinks that actually we should have such good line management processes and a culture of openness that we should have low numbers speaking up. And therefore, I suspect that I will waffle in whenever you ask me in the future on the same point. But my role is to make speaking up accessible and to look out for gaps.
Can we just hold that point? I'll bring people in, but I don't. Are you going to come in on this point? Yeah, because I'd like to stick with this point actually, because one of my questions, you asked it, but what I wouldn't mind you coming back on, Liz and Vicky, is whether we think the quarterly report to the People Committee is actually picking up the issues and dealing with them. Because I think when we took the view that we would delegate functions from the board to our committees, it was with a view that that's where the scrutiny would really take place. That's where time will be taken to really dig into these issues. And it'd be good to get that reassurance that that is indeed what is happening. It's a shame Andrew's not able to be with us this morning. But linked to that, Vicky, is that just this axis between HR and the Principal Guardian that Simon's introduced. I'll invite the comments, and if you can, capture them all as we go through this.
This is the point I was going to come in on actually. So we had about 6 months ago, we had sort of quite a few cases that were about HR. There were HR processes, and we looked at them as a threesome and said, "Wow, what's going on here? Why don't people feel like they can discuss these with HR? We want people to speak up." That there's part of calling an idea would be line manager, or would be HR, or would be whatever was causing the problem. That's the culture we want. That obviously went to People Committee. We'd already discussed it between the three of us. Vicky went away and looked at what was going on and how can we make that process more open. People feel they can come forward, they don't have to go to the Guardian. But it is a dilemma actually, because we don't want people not to be coming to the Guardians. If that doesn't get resolved, we want people to have some sort of way of telling us what's not right. So I would say People Committee are making a big difference. Quite a few former HR directors on there, and because they're obviously like drilling to the detail. And it's not just an HR issue, it's wider, but we drill down into the detail as much as we can to say, right, what can we do about this so people can go for the line management route or the route that's appropriate for them, but without stopping them from coming forward. And I was at a HE session last week on loneliness, actually. I kicked that off for one of the teams, and people were talking about the Guardian. It's like, I can go there if I'm feeling a problem that's making me feel mentally unwell, and so it is making a difference. And we weren't talking about it really as first part of call, it was another option. So I think there's a balance in there. But on the People Committee question, I would say yes, I think it's making a difference. But we also pick things up outside there about should the person have gone to the Guardian, couldn't we have done things better initially?
Yeah, if you remember, Robert Francis's report was because people weren't able to go to the line manager, and there needed to be another outlet for this. It wasn't to replace the line management response, it was to be complementary to and supplementary. Soraya, were you flagging?
Yeah, so Simon, what I was going to ask was that I think numbers are one thing, themes are really important, but are we able to demonstrate, if we look back, that certain areas where there were issues, that those have been resolved, and if we are raising concerns in those areas, they're different. That's the sense check I haven't probably had from the report, and I'm sure you probably have got that. But how do we know that we actually are making a difference in those areas? And I agree with you, it's sometimes quite difficult to sort of say we've heard this and we've done this without it becoming identifiable. So just as a sense check, if we looked back over 3 years, how have we made a real difference, and have we really been able to change behaviours and attitudes and cultures?
Thank you. Yes, because the numbers are low. Firstly, the quarterly reporting is probably the smallest quantity that or greatest frequency that I could give, because the cases would be much more identifiable if we went smaller than that. In terms of whether we make a difference, I think there are 3 levels that can be tested at. The first is at the level of the individual, and follow up with the individual on whether they felt that it helped. And we know, and it's in the report, that all bar one responded positively that it did. There is a select sampling bias there, of course, if only 40% respond, but the ones that responded said they did. The second is something that I couldn't put in a public board paper because it could identify teams or individuals, but there have been some incidents over the last year where enough people have spoken up that we were able to identify a possible issue in a particular team or directorate. And then we have been able to work on that. And I have, I can think of one particular incident, I'm intentionally keeping it vague because of the content, where with consent, I was able to talk to the director. The director responded very positively, took on board the feedback, and it identified the issues raised, identified that rather than it being about the behaviours of 1 or 2 individuals to other individuals, it was the pressure that the entire team were under. And that was used to look at the resourcing of the team. And I believe not only addressed the interpersonal difficulties in the team, but also the efficiency and effectiveness of that team. The third, I think, is then at an organisational level. So if I take the issue of race, there are still barriers to people speaking up if they're from a minority ethnic background. That has been shown in national research and across organisations. But we've worked with our ED&I colleagues and with our staff networks to understand that, but we have also fed it back in. So, for example, the discussions that Navina and Sir David had around being an anti-racist organisation were in part triggered by my monthly one-to-one with Navina when I expressed to her the evidence I was seeing around the levels of racial discrimination in the organisation. And I think what comes from that is that one of the guardian roles is actually to make people feel uncomfortable and feel comfortable with feeling uncomfortable. And I believe that is what's happened with the race issue. So I think it works at 3 levels. And just to say, I greatly value going to the People Committee. They're incredibly supportive, but also it's not an easy ride because they are there to ensure that we keep our feet to the fire on doing the job.
And probably some of that more detail could actually be explored further in People Committee. I think it would be really helpful to give further assurance, but thank you.
I'll bring Rob and John in, but just on the anti-racist, I think the accurate bit is in 5.6 should be, it's not declared itself anti-racist, it's declared an ambition to become anti-racist. It's the ambition point. To claim we're anti-racist would be going far too far, I think. But what we have is an ambition to do that. But so Rob and then
yeah,
John.
it was just quick to go up on Lizzie's point. I see this as an absolutely kind of an important part of what's becoming a better kind of ecosystem. There are other parts to it, given the key themes, bullying and racism and what have you, but there's a suite of options for people. And I was just reflecting that, so for my team, for instance, we all went through kind of active bystander training, which kind of be preventative, i.e. you stand up to it in the moment it's happening, rather than these kind of curative solutions which say, let's go and either explore with HR or freedom to speak up guidance. And I think our focus on that, not on single elements, but on the whole piece, is kind of part of that landscape. Just wanted to reflect that my team have found that particularly useful, because you learn to be comfortable being uncomfortable, because it's hard to make that initial challenge in the moment.
And it speaks to Graham's point earlier about the responsibility on all of us in organisations to speak out when something's not quite right. John.
Sorry, it's not a negative thing if things go up, but it's something that shows change is happening. And really what we want to see is change, isn't it? One way or another in terms of where things are.
Any more? Do you want to say something about the relationship between the Freedom to Speak Up Guardian and the work you've been doing in action?
Yes, please. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. I mean, obviously, as a HR practitioner, it's pretty grueling reading to see that people don't feel that they can universally come to that function. And all colleagues should be able to go to HR. Actually, really healthy cultures, what we know is issues, first of all, get dealt with by the peer level. It can't be dealt with by the peer, they should go to the line management. It can't be dealt with the line management, then HR should step in and assist with that. And as a last resort, then it goes elsewhere. And what we're finding at the moment is that's not the path that people are taking. I would like to think we've just done a restructure of HR, as you know. We're taking a very different approach to HR, less policy-led. My motto to the team is we be kind first and we follow policy second. I think that the approach is starting to bear some fruit, but like all of these things, it will take a little while. Simon and I work closely together. We had a long call yesterday. It's absolutely critical part of our healthy culture that people can speak up. And just to echo the comments that colleagues have already made, having great numbers, great culture, people can speak up, also can spotlight an issue. One of the things I did want to say, though, to John's point is data can be quite flat. It can send us down all sorts of rat traps unless we triangulate it with other data that's going on in the organisation. And just to the point about the culture, People and Culture Committee, we're trying to ask big questions now and use a series of data sets to answer those questions. So we're not saying numbers are up, therefore good or bad thing. We're saying numbers are up here. How does that sit along bullying and harassment? How does that sit on employee set against employee relations numbers? So we can see a picture in the round. We can build a hypothesis of where the hot or the cold spots might be, and then can take some action. So that's what we're trying to do in the People Committee. And I think it's great that we get that level of scrutiny in the People and Culture Committee. It's what the committee is there for. We're asked for assurance. Sometimes we're not always able to give, but it gives us a series of actions to work on.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Any more? Are we good? Simon, thank you.
Thank you.
I think that's a good report and a good conversation. So thank you very much to you and all the other guardians for the work that you do to contribute to a more open culture in health education in England. Appreciated and valued. And yeah, so carry on.
Thank you. And you're all going to do the training as well.
Well, I think you need to be proactive and get the link sent out to people. Digging around some of our websites to find this stuff is not necessarily the best way I would choose to spend my time. So
it will be with Nicola before the next item.
I'm sure it will. I'm sure it
Thank
will.
you very much, everyone.
All right, thanks. I see Phil Huff has joined us. Phil, good morning.
Good morning, Sir David. Good morning, board.
So I think this is an item on giving us an update on the People Advisory Forum work, and I think we've got Phil who co-chairs with Liz. So over to you, Sue.
So I'm going to kick off and then Phil's going to take over. So we're just going to give you an overview of what we've been doing over the last quarter. We met, we had a hybrid meeting in April. We have met throughout the pandemic, and the carers, service users and patients who sit on People's Advisory Forum have supported HEE projects and meetings, and that continues. So we had a hybrid meeting, which was really good. So we're in this room. We had about 6 members on the screen, the rest in the room. Recognising that some of our members are carers, we did have a person that somebody cared for came as an observer, so we could facilitate that, and the meeting worked really well. And we had some other observers in the meeting because they are new members of the People's Advisory Forum, and we'll come on to that. And Phil's actually not with us today because he's training the new members, so that's a virtual training to facilitate people.
Today.
Yeah. So Jo Lenahan came on to our last meeting so that the forum could contribute to the strategy. We'd already made some comments in writing, but she came and did quite a long session eliciting the views of PATH and how we could shape the strategy. Every meeting we have a summary of what PAF members have been doing for HE, and that's now in the format of we said what happened. So we can look at, is the voice being represented? If it's a PAF member who's maybe not feeling confident or didn't put something away across in the right way, can we support that? Or if it's something's not happened, why was that, and what do we do in future to think about that? But generally, actually, PAF members come along to HE project groups, their opinions are listened to, and that gets into policy or strategy. It's only occasionally that we have to follow up and say, can you tell us what happened there? So David, the new chair of PAF, was with us, and David, you've been to quite a few meetings. I think Navina came along as well to the last meeting to talk about the transition into the new organisation and what that actually means for PAF and PAF members, and how the great work HE has done in this area could be modelled, replicated in the other arms-led bodies, but how we can learn from them as well. So I've touched briefly on the recruitment of new PAF members. We had a brilliant response to an advert that went out. We got a lot of people applying. PAF members that shaped the recruitment, in that we felt it was too difficult for people to use the normal recruitment forms. It would put people off applying. So we had a very simple process, all signed off by HR, so we can not sort of go with the policy, but go with like what will work here for this group. With 4 questions to people who wanted to apply. We then assessed that, PAF members shortlisted, and again we did an interview where we had some questions, but they got the questions beforehand so they could prepare. So it wasn't a memory test or something that was really stressful. Well, it probably was stressful, but it was less stressful than it would be. We did the interviews on Teams, and we appointed 6 fantastic people to be part of PAF from a range of ages, range of backgrounds that will bring a lot to PAF moving forward. Phil, myself, Liz Fenton on the interview panel, and we were really overwhelmed actually by the quality of people we had applying. So it was a good experience, and most of those people joined us at the last meeting. I'll hand over to you now, Phil, to pick up the rest of the report.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Liz. Yeah, I just wanted to touch on that. Obviously, we have induction running today, and I'm pleased to say all members were able to attend. We went with a virtual because a few people were unable to. I mean, it's brilliant to see we have a PAF member literally just had surgery in the last 3 days that has joined us virtually because he feels it's so important. So again, the commitment that's shown by people at youth services is just phenomenal to see, really. And Liz has already explained, we saw that during the recruitment process. So we have Colin, Emma, Harsha, Michelle, Palumi and Hania that are all started officially today as new PAF members. We have an induction programme running with them today that's obviously supported by Liz and Amanda Robson as well. Just to cover some of the, I won't go into detail of the report, you've all had the report and seen the report. So just to pick up some of the things that we've been talking about, I think it's really refreshing and it's no surprise really the way that HE has worked and continues to work, that we had a really robust conversation about the future of health education in England and what that might look like and what it might not look like. And I think that was really well supported by members, and certainly Sir David was very helpful in kind of navigating us through some of those discussions and some of those really important things. Liz has already mentioned that we have a desire that we use the experiences and the values that HE has developed over the years, and we use them to kind of flavour the future and what the new organisation might look like. I say this constantly, and I don't just say it because I'm asked to say it, but actually HEE is one of the most genuine pieces of involvement I've ever done in my 20-odd years of being a patient and a carer. So I think for me, we have to hold on to those values. We have to hold on to those really core kind of processes and procedures and the way that we work in whatever the kind of new organisation will look like going forward. Obviously, a key focus is embedding even more the co-chair role, and obviously I now have a shiny new co-chair to work alongside, which I'm not daunted by at all, I promise. So I think it's really exciting really to see how much the organisation does value the role of lived experience, and that will continue going forward, into the new organisation as well. And I think we need to continue to build on that and to move that forward. We're really involved with lots of different programs. Obviously, you get the feedback from all the programs that we're involved with, so I won't go into lots of detail there. But I think it is worth saying that actually within all those programs, be that advanced clinical practice, be that the primary care work we're doing, blended learning, the mental health work we've just done, I will highlight that because I guess I have a speciality interest in mental health. The report that Baroness Tavistock produced had a huge PAF involvement, and that sat on all the working groups, and she really valued the lived experience in that process. So again, it really highlights the value and the work that PAF do, but actually the support and the value that HE puts on us as an organisation, and as a subcommittee of board. We're very vocal and we're very clear about our roles on those committees, and actually there is a challenge sometimes to those committees, but 99% of the time that's a positive challenge, and it improves the kind of process and the direction of where those work streams and those projects go, really. So I would just kind of continue to highlight the work that we do, and to raise the issues about we need to be involved in lots of the programs, and if people feel that there is areas where more lived experience should be, then PAF's always open to that. Now we have new members on board. We are developing our capacity, and we'll obviously be improving our capacity around that with new PAF members. As Liz says, we're hoping to get back to more face-to-face meetings and a hybrid model of both online and face-to-face. And again, we need to develop some of those ways of working. It was found that there was a specialist strategic group in NHS England with lived experience. So this lived experience strategic group, as we always pointed out, PAF is far more strategic than any other strategic group. That's what we're all about. So hopefully we can develop relationships with that group and see how they work and learn across, really, the way that the organisations can learn from each other. I'll stop there and just pause for any questions, if that's all right. Thank you.
So will you just say something about the connection that PAF members have with working groups? Because you sometimes get the idea that the work goes on in a committee meeting around the board table like this, but what has particularly impressed me, I have to say, is just the sheer multitude of meetings that members of the forum actually attend. So they're actually not just participating, they're actually involved. They're involved alongside HEE colleagues, key stakeholders in the actual discussions and the decision making about what's going to follow, rather than this idea that it's just at a consultative level. My observation will be that this is co-production in its execution rather than consultation. But as you say, you are very experienced making the contribution from the perspective of people with lived experience, so you can speak with authority on this.
Yeah, I think that's so true, really. PAF, ironically, the PAF meetings is the culmination, really, of the work we've already done, and I think we get together quarterly and we discuss the things we've been involved in, and obviously we receive presentations. But as you said, Sir David, that's very little of the work we do, really. The main work is involved in the working groups and the projects and the various kind of working committees that are happening right across the breadth. I think there's 40. I think at one point there was 40 odd different programs that our members are involved with, and that's majority of those levels. It's quite a senior level. It's almost on the kind of strategic planning side of it. But there is lots of work that happen in different tiers, and I know with just thinking about the last thing, the big thing I did last was obviously the mental health one. So there was an overarching group that Baroness Tavistock chaired, where all PAF members attended it, were involved, but actually they didn't do the work there. They did the work in the working groups that sat underneath. So they looked at severe mental illness, they looked at children and young people, and they actually used their lived experience at a very direct level about actually, what does this mean for patients? What does this mean for families? And I think that's what kind of adds the advantage to that, really. I think it's a real honest conversation about, if you implement this and you train a member of staff to do this, for me, it would feel this way. And I think that has a direct connection back to kind of education and training, really.
Okay, Mark, please.
It's just to follow on from that point. I had some feedback for PAF or for an external stakeholder, and I think that kind of we understand how this works, and we kind of normalised it in some senses. But an external stakeholder wrote to me and said, "I have never seen this level of co-production from start to finish. The equal role of patient service users to nurses throughout this review is a true exemplar to how mental health workforce policy should be formed." So external stakeholders see your work, Phil, the leadership of Liz and others within the team as fundamentally, again, a change in relation to the way you did work. But that was from an external stakeholder who not routinely gives me this sort of feedback. But this I thought was important to share. The work of the PAF group is seen as exemplary. So thank you and well done.
Brilliant. Andrew, please.
Thank you. I mean, this sounds, Liz, Phil, this sounds fantastic. Thank you. I wonder whether actually building on that one, whether we, especially as we move to the new organisation, that there will be wins and things like that that are forcing change. Do we have a strong list of the impact that PAF has made on what HE has done? I mean, the mental health nursing and the Baroness Tavistock report is highlighting this one. But do we somewhere have a sense of this has actually changed because of the input of that PAF? And if so, is that something that we should be thinking about exteriorising? I mean, publishing, I don't necessarily mean in the Journal of Scandinavian log cutting, but in a blog or something, in a blog or something like that to actually make it clear. Because this is something we're doing well, then people can learn from us.
Yeah, I would say we do. So every quarter we bring this report called Closing the Loop, which is what PAF members have been doing and what impact it's had or not. And then we can pull that together to make a report. And we do contribute to the annual report as well. But probably that will be sort of a shorter version. So yeah, we do. We could pull that together to an annual document. Yeah.
You're also making a point, I think, about as we transition into a new organisation, about using this as a platform for continuity.
Yeah.
And if you can demonstrate the benefit of it, then it's an argument to keep it or something similar, at least.
So we can.
Can we come back to that? I'd like to just pick at that thread, and I know Liz Fenton is a real champion of this work, so might be an ask that we make of Liz to draw some things together. Patrick and then Soraya.
Just an anecdote, because it happened yesterday, but the PAF don't just work on working groups. I had a PAF member co-chair with me the Jamie Rental Awards final award yesterday, and it was really helpful because people have to present what they want to do in education that we award fits the NHS constitution and our mandate, and they really do challenge the people back in terms of what it means to the patient. There's also a bit of PAF envy going on from our digital colleagues elsewhere, because what we've got from our PAF members on the blended learning programme and digital education is not replicated in other ALBs. It certainly makes a difference in terms of how we shape those programmes.
Well, credit to Phil and Liz. I mean, some very tech savvy people as well, actually, which makes the point that people aren't just a patient.
Yeah.
Kind of do other things. Soraya.
Phil and Liz, I think I've seen this work not very well in other organisations, and actually members have got quite disillusioned that they've been invited in to take part, and then it doesn't actually come to fruition. But I think what I've observed here for the last 3 years is how well this is working, and I do hope that we can develop it further and actually ensure that it goes forward, and also to make sure that across our organisation that teams are well aware of the expertise that PAF members have and how they can be utilised. Again, in another organisation, it was a group that was working very well, but it was working in isolation with 1 or 2 teams and actually didn't benefit the whole organisation. So I'd hope to see that develop further and continue. So thank you.
Very good. Anybody else want to come in? Sorry, Giles, sorry.
No, it's going back a bit, but I think one of the really significant contributions PAF members have made over the years was, sometimes they are individual, but we actually had somebody who gave up a lot of time to support Wendy and Shona and me and Liam's predecessor working with the Higher Education Funding Council to actually allocate the extra 1,000 that we were allocating medical student places around the country, and that was a big commitment, but it was a hugely valuable attendance on that. So there are some really substantial things where people have input and made a difference.
Very good, Giles, and that speaks to the point. Phil, I wonder whether we could give some thought, and Mark, I wonder whether Liz might help with this, or whoever you think is appropriate. But I wonder whether we could send a letter to Richard Meddings, the chair of NHS England, and Amanda, saying, you know, we have this thing called PATH. This is the stuff that we've done, and this is the difference it's made. And Giles, that's probably 3 or 4 sentences to go in the letter of what difference it's made. And in a sense, what we're doing there is handing the tradition, the baton on. Because actually, in fairness to NHSE, they do some good work on involving people as well. I don't think we should occupy this space. We're better than others at all. There's some really good stuff. But actually, there is a continuity through this transition that I think we should secure, really, and that'll be continuity for people, people like yourself, Phil, as well as the work that is undertaken. But I think Andrew's question about okay then, so what? I think needs answering. It's absolutely imperative that that's answered. The risk is we just look like we're strutting our credentials instead of actually this helps us make a difference to what we do.
Just there is a structured process for matching PATH members to working groups, strategic groups, so that might be helpful as well, actually, that we know the skills we've got.
Yeah.
And if you're running a group, you have to fill in some documentation saying we need this sort of person. So that's where the expertise matches the programme. So that might be useful. So, and Mark and Liz,
I'll pick that with Liz and people's contributions.
Well, I think that's one of the impressive things about the selection. It brings in people with a range of backgrounds that can then match them to the kind of work that we undertake. Anyway, okay, Phil, thanks for joining us and taking time out from the induction. Thanks for everything you do in co-chairing. And how do you know I'm not as intimidated as you are? I'll leave you with that thought.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sir David. Thank you, board. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Phil. Well, we said thank you to you earlier, but that's an example of just how we've completely redesigned that work, and tremendous actually. And the trust that Phil has in you and the ability to actually translate those relationships is palpable, actually, you can see. Yeah. Oh, we'll talk about it now. Okay, right, let's, where am I up to then? Oh, Callum, come on, you can lower the tone.
It's a tough ask for it has to be said. So I'll try not to lower it too much. I actually want to be quite positive with what I'm going to say, which is, you know, that we've just obviously we've already had a paper in March showing our indicative allocation. We are now confident of our allocation, but still awaiting that final or formal letter. But I think that is going to be arriving very, very shortly. And so the overall result, though, is I'm really pleased that we can report that, as it says in the paper, our funding allocation is going to go up by 502 million for this year, which is a really chunky growth. Let's be absolutely clear about that. And that number enables us to deliver the plans that we talked to you about in March, and essentially is what was agreed with NHS England and the Department back in December. And that includes all the headline core growth around 7,500 medical students in each year's intake, 24 months training in GP, moving from the prior 18 months, the highest ever recruitment we've had to clinical courses, a range of tariff reforms and including inflationary uplifts, which we've presented previously, and maintenance of pretty important recent developments, such as the CPD scheme, and which will continue to grow in line with workforce growth. So that funding is a good result, and it includes 160 million, which comes from NHS England rather than Department of Health, which covers all the long-term priority growth areas that they want us to invest in. A lot of that is in mental health and cancer. So it's a really decent increase in a economically a difficult period. Unfortunately, it is just 1 year, so we still don't know where we stand for years 2 and 3. So that is a risk, which I'll come back to. I think the biggest risk to the plan this year is in achieving that growth at a point when the service is under a lot of pressure to focus on service. We don't quite know how that will manifest itself, but clearly we've already heard today about the tension between delivering service and delivering training. So that will be a pressure. It's also unclear in where we're at the moment in terms of the state of the economy, everything else that's going on, quite how attractive going into training will be. We've had a couple of real bumper years. Whether that will continue remains to be seen. So having said that, I think those risks, we're doing everything we can to manage those in terms of early delegation of budgets out to our regional directors and national directors, using better data and just enabling that investment and activity to get underway. And we've done that, although I'm only formally announcing this today. We've essentially been trying to get ahead of that curve, and our teams are doing that. So I think that's really good. And we are already underway with process for looking at the next 2 years of financial planning. We'll provide a brief to the board in June on that, and we can make a public statement in July around that process. But clearly, that's really important we get that fixed down. It's difficult to time it this year. Ideally, we'd like to do things quickly, but as we know, the strategic workforce planning that's going to happen later on in the year, and there's a question mark about whether you go ahead or in line with that, a bit of both, etc. We can talk to you about that in future meetings. But we're very much on with that as well. So I think it is actually a positive message, and I think it's all about getting out and delivering that and trying to secure that investment, make sure it happens.
Okay, questions, comments?
I think if I may, so David, just the obvious one that we're now in June. We're going to be in June soon, we're in May, ahead of myself, but really to keep an eye Q2 how we're actually able to deploy this and keep ahead of it.
Absolutely.
The point you were making, I think, in your intro is that you anticipated some of it. So
yes, it is.
We've gone.
We are acting on this. Yeah, I mean, the Department of Health did said, go with this as an indicative. So we have been doing that. Yes, so we should be on track.
Any more? Big congratulations, Callum, to you and the team. I think it really justifies the patience of working on a trilateral basis and getting there in the end.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, that was critical having that.
I think the old behaviours would not have delivered this. Yeah. I think, but by acting trilaterally, I think you've secured it. It might have given you 1 or 2 grey hairs, but you've got it there. So,
they're coming anyway.
Well, but big congratulations. It's a tremendous achievement. So the point you made about, I mean, this is a public meeting, but the point you made about how far people know about this, have we thought about messaging this out?
So we've communicated this in all our planning conversations. So we've done that through obviously at regional level and system level through our regional teams, and we also obviously contract with all our placement providers and so forth, and also universities around plans. So it's all gone out in an operational sense. I don't think we've sort of done a kind of put a big sign behind an aeroplane flying over the. So we could think about whether we want to do that. But I would suggest all the operational partners members are very well aware of where we're at and what it means for them specifically.
And the number of people that have commented or asked us the question about whether we've got our budget sorted out, where until recently I would say, no, we haven't got our budget sorted out. These are the members of Parliament, people that work in think tanks, etc.
Yes.
Where, you know, I've been asked a straight question, I've given a straight response to that question. Might they be aware?
So I think at the moment we've been saying to people, purely look back to what we've said in our public announcements, because until this point we didn't feel confident to be able to do that. But I think we would want to follow up this with formal pieces, you say, for the national organisations that we do get requests from around funding. I've already had sorts of communications deal about that. So
could we think about how we can do that?
Yeah.
You know, this became as the Health and Care Bill went through Parliament, and as the Health Select Committee raised their questions around the strategic settlement, we were asked whether we'd had a budget. We actually said, no, it's not a settled budget, but now we've got one, although it's for a year. I think it would be right that we actually contacted those organisations or made it common knowledge that we've had a settlement for this year. Rob, please.
Yeah, one of the places that's really clear is where we have specific investments to support the recovery programmes by pathway, whether it's cancer or whatever.
Yeah.
And those people are very much aware that we needed this money and now we've got it. So all of a sudden the plan hangs together. And I think that's an important kind of story to tell. And there's get more traction when it's applied to something specific rather than kind of a general, we've got some money. Yeah, so.
And I think to that point, you know, we end up in a lot of conversations when people are advocating for their area and asking us to do things, and that often is a conversation which takes place publicly. But once the settlement comes, you very rarely get any further discussion to follow on. That actually, you know, people advocated, they made the case, we listened, we made the argument. The argument has been settled by the funders who have, you know, so I think it reflects well on the department and NHS England as well as HEE, and I think in fairness we should reflect that back to people. It's a justification of it, and not just let those that were advocating who will have the satisfaction that their activity has been successful.
It's a classic you said we did.
Yeah. I think there is a really important narrative about the tone the organisation has wanted to set about how it has a grown-up conversation about resourcing and what it can do within the resources. And we've not been histrionic, we've not, you know, we've been very professional, I think, and I would argue it's been successful. And yes, you could always ask for more, we could always have made the case for more, but actually, as you've said, Callum, that's a very good result. And in the board paper, you've actually talked about what percentage increases are.
Yeah.
You know, we're talking of 10% increases in expenditure, which I think is an important point to hold on to. It's important to pick up on Sophie's point about the message when you're out on the service delivery front, that you actually do have a sense that these conversations are resulting not just in more people coming into training, but more money being invested in training as well. And that's the point that I think people can get, because I think it's important that where we can provide hope, that we do provide that hope that there is an improvement to come in the future. But well done for that. Yeah, well, thank you. I think that gets us to the end of our agenda. I've not been notified of any of the business. The digital readiness education programme is there for information and awareness only. So this is a way, without an introduction, without a debate, of bringing work which is underway to the attention of the board, but deliberately doing it in a public board because it places this work on the public record, so to speak. So it's in part about how we give oxygen and sunlight to some important work, in this case work that Patrick and his team are leading, but also some pretty important work on global health partnerships, which is some work with the World Health Organization. which Giles is reflecting, but I think Jedburn leads on. I spent some time last week with some people from the European office of WHO, and it really made me think about how much attention I've paid to activity going on at the WHO, not in the sense that that I'm trying to track what's happening in other countries, but what are the trends that are emerging? What are the global trends that are emerging, and how are they responding to that? And it made me realise that even when I was in the Department of Health, a lot of the global work that was undertaken by senior civil servants took place in quite a silo, actually, and it didn't really penetrate. Yet there were some fantastically talented people doing some really important work. And particularly on workforce, as Joe Lennon has made connection with Jim Campbell, who's the WHO people director, basically, HR director. There is an awful lot of I've kind of made a commitment to myself to actually pay some attention to what's happening at WHO as a way of actually just lifting my eyes, not just to the national horizon, but also trying to look internationally as well. Whether I read everything on the agenda is another issue, but actually just understanding what is on the agenda and why is a commitment that I'm making. Go on, I can see I've set you two off at the bottom.
Well, I didn't want to open the debate except to say this is cross-HE work. So Rob's team, Patrick's team are both heavily involved, as indeed are some of Wendy's colleagues as well. So I wouldn't want it to be thought it's just the Global Partnerships Directorate who they catalyse it, they support it, but there are loads of people doing great work and putting their expertise out to international use as well as here. That's all there is.
So just very quickly, David, I was fortunate to be part of the team that spent a week virtually in the Ukraine the week before the war. I just wanted to pay tribute to the people in Ukraine who we worked with. What they must be going through is awful, but yeah, they had a real commitment to the future of health and the health workforce. So just wish them all the very best.
No, thank you, Rob. I'm sure that some people will support that as well. I think the point, Giles and colleagues, is actually we just need to give some oxygen and sunlight to this work that we're doing, because otherwise it remains not visible, and I think it is important. So I think that gets us to the end of our agenda. So thank you all for your contribution, and I think we can formally close the meeting, Matt, and is it? And Jessica,